I resent that, and I don't even know what you're talking about.
Timeliness, not
Or when that
Not
hands down.
accuracy?
base it on.
All right. I think Mr. Kiley will be
If
here
you want
just a
Polito for
second.
nothing else, you want him for being speedy.
Don't beat around.
All right, so why don't we get started since it is the witching hour. Jerry, are you all set? And Paul, are we all set on the tape recording?
Jerry.
Okay, that's.
Read the tape recorder.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the January 2012 a monthly meeting for the Fairfield Board of Finance. Happy New Year to everyone. At this time, I'd ask everyone to rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I'm going to ask our first selectman, otherwise known as the birthday boy, can wheel himself up here in his advanced state of decrepitness.
Or bring your walker, either one.
Are we 60 today, Mike?
Lead us in the Pledge of
I
Allegiance.
couldn't help myself. It's a big one.
If you can remember it, sir, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
It's in the days of my youth. I pledge allegiance.
of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday. We're not going to sing to you, don't worry.
First time a first selectman has an assisted care facility in town hall.
Wow. That's your boy, too.
Sitting in this seat.
This is somewhat of a,
Yeah, see, it's, yeah. It's
All right.
blasphemous.
Former Democratic Town Committee member, Ken Ryan.
all right. Tonight, we have a relatively full agenda. I'm hoping we can move through it relatively quickly. The first, we have two sets of minutes to approve: the organizational meeting held on December 9th and the regular monthly meeting held on the 13th. We're going to take those separately because we had different attendance records at those meetings. Secondly, we're going to hear a report from the investment subcommittee of our board that was tabled from the meeting on December 13th. Third, we're going to hear a report from the budget subcommittee of our board as we ramp up for our budget deliberations coming in the months of February and March. Fourth, we're going to receive and consider the comprehensive annual financial report for the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2011 by J.H. Cohn. Mr. Sanchafani's here. We're going to have our annual report later in this meeting. Item number 5, to hear, consider, and act upon a resolution authorizing the issuance of bonds in the principal amount of $225,000 to finance the remaining unpaid costs incurred in the connection with the construction of the Harbor Road Bridge. Sixth, we're going to hear and consider and act upon a resolution authorizing the issuance of bonds in the principal amount of $961,400 to finance the replacement of the Merritt Street Bridge. Those two items, I'm sure, will be addressed by Mr. White and the birthday boy, Mr. Tetro. Item number 7, to hear, consider, and act upon any other communications. I've just got some housekeeping items in that. And item number 8, to hear, consider, and act upon any other business. Any questions or comments before we move along? Seeing none, we're going to go directly to the minutes of the organizational meeting held on December 9th, 2011. Any questions, comments, concerns on those minutes? Seeing none, all in favor of approving those minutes? Opposed, abstentions, those minutes are approved. Item number 1A, to approve the minutes of the regular monthly meeting held on December 13th, 2011. Questions, comments, concerns? Mr. DeWitt.
It's a minor typo at the bottom of page 3, number 7. It's actually 901, it's $901, it's $901,000. It's not a big deal, but.
Comma as opposed to a decimal.
Okay.
$901, I would have voted for it.
Do we need a motion to change that, or can we just go ahead and change that?
We will edit it accordingly.
Okay. So, yeah, it's a typo of a period versus a comma, a decimal versus a comma.
As is stated in the body, is that the RTM reduced that amount from 901 to 725.
Yep. All right. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, can we approve the minutes as adjusted or amended by Mr. DeWitt? All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? I'm going to abstain as I missed that meeting as well. Okay, so that item carries. And item number 2,
Yeah, Mary as well.
Mary as well. Okay. Mr. Brown did indicate that he will be a little bit late for the meeting tonight, but he will be here. And I think Mr. Stone indicated the same thing.
Should be here by 8, he said.
Okay, both of them we're expecting by 8 p.m. Okay, to hear and discuss a report from the Investment Subcommittee of the Board of Finance. You may recall that in the summer months of 2011, I appointed a subcommittee to look at the investment activities of our operating cash. So this has nothing to do with pension funds. It has nothing to do with really quote-unquote long-term investments. This has to do with operating cash and how we manage the cash of the town, how Mr. Hiller, along with the First Selectman, manages the cash of the town. That committee was appointed. It included Mr. Brockfeld, who was then elected the chairman, myself, and Mr. Brown, and we had a series of meetings with the First Selectman and Mr. Hiller to discuss the items. So I'm going to turn that directly over to Mr. Brockfeld so he can speak about the report which he has put together.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Addressing Mr. Bolito's point from before, I made a few New Year's resolutions this year, and one of them was to be brief this year, to contribute to hopefully our not going deep into the night in our meetings. So I will start right now, correct. So I'm going to try and make this brief. This report was in our packages, Paul distributed, so I'm sure most people should have it.
Twice now.
Twice, that's right, because this was postponed. As Tom pointed out, this investment account has been a topic of discussion. I brought it up many times, and the members of the board here have brought it up and agreed that it needed to be investigated, or to, it's a bad word, to be evaluated. We had a 3-person committee, myself, I was elected chairman, Tom, and Jim Brown. Also point out that Paul Hiller and Mike Tetro were there for all of the meetings, and we also had some interesting guests, including some representatives from some of the brokerage firms that we do business with. Starting, I'd like to say that I can't imagine a subcommittee could have worked much better in terms of people being agreeable and cooperative, and the way we work together, including special thanks to Mr. Hiller and Mr. Tetro for cooperating with us on a topic that we thought was very important. We met a whole bunch of times. I think the report says we met 3 times during the summer and fall, and all the meetings were noticed with the town clerk. Agendas were distributed and minutes were taken. Let me just go over quickly the 4 topics of concern that we dealt with, and then where we stand on those 4 issues, if I could. First and foremost, Paul informed us that the town keeps, and Paul, do me a favor, correct me on anything I say here that may not be exactly accurate, keeps a large amount of cash, ready cash, in People's Bank for the purposes, I'll just say, of liquidity. And it can be up to $20 million at times, and that's perfectly normal and proper. One of the things that concerned us was that that amount of money in one bank isn't normally covered by the FDIC insurance. And even though People's Bank is an enormous and healthy bank, as we saw during 2008, any institution, Lehman, Bear Stearns, et cetera, can come under pressure. So it turns out that by making a relatively small change in the way the account is titled and giving up what is an infinitesimal amount of interest, we're able to get full FDIC coverage on the entire unlimited balance. Paul, make sure I'm being accurate there.
It's not FDIC coverage, because the FDIC limit is still $250,000. However, People's, under state statute, since we are obviously municipal deposits, has to collateralize those deposits
Right.
in non-interest-bearing accounts. And so they're basically under state, and this is restricted to municipal accounts. In other words,
Gotcha.
someone
Okay.
else can't go in there and ask for the same thing.
Gotcha. So,
But it's not FDIC.
bottom line is that it's a significantly safer way to keep our money. And to Paul and Mike's credit, they saw this as being a good idea and made the change almost instantly. So I thank them for that. So that's been taken care of. Second major topic, probably the topic that took up the most of our time, and I think also this board over the last year and a half has heard me speak about this a lot because this came up during our meetings. The investment account contained about $10 million worth of mortgage-backed securities that I'll preface by saying there's nothing wrong with these securities. They're actually perfectly fine securities, but we determined not for this account. And I won't go into great detail except that they are not liquid and they have a fair amount of price volatility. And for an investment account as opposed to, well, let me rephrase that. I don't even like the word investment account. I like the word transaction account because investment account makes you think long-term like a pension fund. It's not. This is a transaction account where money comes in and money goes out on a fairly liquid basis. And these securities, we all agreed, Paul initially had some disagreements but came around, that these securities, while they were fine for most investing purposes, they weren't good for this purpose because they wouldn't be readily changeable into cash, and they do have a fair amount of price volatility. So after a fair amount of back and forth on that one, the town, under Mr. Tetro and Mr. Hiller's instruction, liquidated those securities, and I may add, at a good price. We were at a good time in the market, so there wasn't any cost to the town for the liquidation. So that's topic number 2, and it's been resolved. That leaves 2 topics that either weren't resolved at the time I wrote this report or still aren't resolved, and Paul can address that. The town doesn't have a written policy for this account. The state has a statute which we follow, which we have to follow, and it's, in my opinion, or our opinion, too broad. And it allows for investments that I think may not be suitable for this type of account. So while we are, by all means, following state statutes, it was of the committee's agreement that we should write a town-specific investment policy that tightened up those details. And Paul shared with us the policy that the town of Darien, Connecticut uses. We kind of like that policy. And I think the way we left it, Paul, was we were going to ask you to work with that as a base and maybe make some amendments that you think are necessary and then come back and present it to our committee, hopefully in the near term. So that's where we left it when I wrote this, and you're nodding your head, so I assume that's where we still are right now. Okay. And fourth, and this is where it gets a little more subjective, but I think Mr. Flynn was very strong on this. You know, I've worked with Paul for several years now, and he is totally capable of running this account. He has investment experience and managerial experience and experience in the town. However, someday there won't be Paul, there'll be a new Paul, and that person may not have that kind of experience or expertise. And I think it's unfair to both the town and to the future Paul for there to be so much discretion and so much responsibility with one man overseen by the first selectman, of course. And we decided to recommend, and I know you're working on this, that the town first do the investment policy, which I spoke about before, and then set up some sort of guidelines and then use that to interview and hire a outside cash management operation, probably a bank or a trust department or something like that, who could execute to our specifications the way this account is managed. So that takes the subjectivity out of the hands of one person, and also, as a side benefit, frees up that person, Paul in this case, or the future Paul, from spending a lot of his time managing this and doing all the other stuff that we beat him up about that he can't get done on time. So that was the fourth issue, and I think that one is still open, but we're working towards that. So that is basically it. Again, I can't say, this is the first time I chaired a subcommittee, and I can't say how much I appreciate Tom Flynn and Jim Brown's efforts and the cooperation from Paul and Mike Tetro, because it was as easy as I can imagine a committee could have been. So on that note, I'll let Tom add anything. Jim's not here, and then answer any questions from the board or, if it's appropriate, anybody else.
Thank you. I want to add my thanks to the First Selectman and the Chief Fiscal Officer, and I also want to extend my appreciation to Mr. Brockfeld, who did a fine job chairing the committee as well as pushing and leading the charge. A couple items to amplify on what Mr. Brockfeld said. The first item, that I think bears a little bit more notice relates to the types of investments that were in this account. Again, this is a liquid or a transactional account where money needs to be available to pay off obligations at any given point in time. One of the concerns that we had with some of the types of investments in the account was, as Ken pointed out, they were relatively volatile. And not only could that cause you to take a loss if you had to liquidate them for a specific cash need sooner rather than later, but also specifically on a year end, let's say June 30th, those investments would need to be marked to market to get to a fair market value, priced at market. And what would happen then is, if for some reason at that specific date the fair market value was diminished, that could have an adverse effect on your fund balance, which, as we know, has always been a cause of concern with our credit rating agencies, that we don't have enough in a fund balance. So that was of particular concern to our committee, in that everything could be right. The fund could be managed very well. There could be one small dip in the market over a June 30th date, and it could cause our fund balance to be diminished to a point that we wouldn't want it on a reporting date. And that was another consideration that we had. The other item that Mr. Brockfeld spoke to that I just want to amplify a little bit was the fourth item, and that was the recommendation of a cash management outside firm. Whether we have an outside firm come in and evaluate the day-to-days of how we manage our cash to make sure we're doing it in the most efficient way possible, and we're lowering our fees with the various banks and financial institutions, and not taking on undue risk, such as the risk with the FDIC insurance or things like that. That would be one benefit we would get out of this. We would also free up some of Mr. Hiller's time, because I think, as he displayed to us, this does take up a fair amount of his time to manage the funds and the liquidity in and out of these investments and these accounts on a day-to-day basis. And Paul, I don't know if you have any comments to make on that or anything further to say. Anything? No. So, and I too would like to thank Paul for all his efforts in this. And any other questions? Or?
No, unless anybody on the board has.
Sure. Any questions or commentary from the board? Mr. Belita.
First of all, excellent job. I think this is certainly a topic that was a concern to all of us, and to get some direction is very important. I'm curious from Mr. Hiller and or Mr. Tetro on items 3 and 4, the policy and the outsourcing of the management of the policy or of the account. What's the timetable on accomplishing these goals?
With putting a budget in place, and I think, and obviously I think that policy should be adopted by this board and discussed by this board, and realizing the pressures that we're going to be under in the next 90 days, frankly, I think we can disseminate some information, but as far as being really able to put this into place, I would target maybe the April quarterly review meeting. Frankly, you know, we're as Mr. Brackfeld points out in his second point, the one bunch of securities that we were concerned with, two actions have been taken, I think. One is the movement of the operating funds into that are fully secured, and just to give you an example, on that account, and we all know what the interest rate environment is like right now. In the last fiscal year, that account earned the whopping sum of about $1,500 in interest, with having balances as high as $20 million. So, you know, it was a rather minimal hit as far as that's concerned. And the mortgage-backed securities are gone. So it's not something where you know, we do have with some CDs, we do have some, what I'll term FDIC risk with some local banks beyond the FDIC limits. And whether we want to address that fully as we go along, we can determine that in policy. But I would think certainly to have something to you during the budget season with deliberations probably at the April quarterly review. And at that point, I would think maybe have an RFP process in the early spring to various firms and go from there.
Thank you.
Or when I say firms, brokerage houses and/or banks.
Thank you, Mr. Hiller. Any other questions, comments from board members? Elaine?
Just a quick question, coming from a banking background. I'm just out of curiosity. What is the new registration of the account? What do they title it now?
It's basically the general fund account.
But, I'm sorry, at People's Bank, what's the type of account it's in now? Just is it called a municipal checking account?
Yeah, it's rolling into a non-interest-bearing sweep account
Okay.
because there are several, maybe 15.
Yeah, we have some checking accounts for our accounts payable, we have some for payroll, we have a tax collector account, there's multiple.
Okay.
And there are also accounts for town payroll, Board of Education payroll, and so it's really where everything rolls into one at the end of the day, or when the clock strikes 12.
I understand.
Excuse me,
Sweep account.
Thank you.
Mrs. Leclerc?
non-interest-bearing sweep.
Right.
Paul, would you be able to get us some kind of, like, written explanation on how that works, like the FDIC insurance? Just so I can understand it a little better. I understand how a sweep account works, but you said how it was insured, and that's.
Well, obviously, the FDIC insurance covers any bank deposits for an individual, or in our case, a municipality, up to $250,000 per institution that we're with. I think the concern, naturally, with the account was, as the chair points out, or as Mr. Brackfeld points out, at varying times, particularly during the tax collection season, we'll get up in periods of time pretty high there. Now, it gets drawn down pretty quickly, but those funds above $250,000, we're in essence at risk. The state, and I can't quote to you, I can get it for you, the state banking regulations, which gives municipalities an opportunity to get into an account which is collateralized by the bank and is non-interest bearing. It's guaranteed by the bank,
By the bank.
so they have to collateralize it.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the other thing is I thank the committee for putting together this report and for doing all this work. But what I would be interested in seeing when we discuss the policy or the cash management is a list of the type of accounts and how much money we have invested, just so I have a better understanding of how it is being invested and how it will be managed.
Absolutely.
Because I guess I'm having a hard time, if it's mostly like in cash type of investments, why we would need someone to hire someone to manage it. But I guess if I saw how it was invested, then that would answer the question.
Yeah.
We can put that together for you. Basically, I think there are essentially three major types of accounts that we have. We have brokerage accounts at 5 brokerage houses, which primarily hold securities, approved securities under the state statutes. So those are primarily U.S. Treasury bills, agency paper, and also municipal bonds of other municipalities, both within Connecticut and in some cases outside of Connecticut, within the statute. The second piece are we have CDs, certificates of deposits, at 2 local banks. And the third piece, we have money market accounts at 5 or 6 banks within the region.
And one of the things, Mrs. Leclerc, is not only the the types of investments, but you just heard Mr. Hiller rattle off all the different accounts. From looking at it, and I've seen the list, it's very inefficient. And you'll recall that, in fact, our colleague, Mr. Kiley, kept reminding us last budget cycle to actually break out the fees that we were actually paying. And Ms. Gaffney knows from her experience on banks, they make a lot of money on those fees. And so the study would not just be to outsource it to get a greater source of investment income, but also to make sure that we were managing the money efficiently and lowering the fees that we were paying on those funds that are sitting around, particularly in this time when interest rates are so low that we're making de minimis amounts of money that aren't even offsetting some of the fees that are paid to manage the money by the institutions. So that was the thought process behind it. Mr. DeWitt?
I'll be quick. So the cash management firm, is there an opportunity for us to possibly use Peoples, since they've got a lot of our cash? Maybe, is that a service they would offer us for having $20 million sitting in their bank for months and months?
For a fee.
Yeah, well, okay. Maybe a reduced fee, I guess is my point.
Peoples has just established, and I did get, not a proposal, but just within the past week, get a proposed policy. They've been working, and in fact, as Mr. Brackville points out, Peoples was at one of the meetings that we were at with representatives from Morgan Stanley. They've developed a relationship with the People's Wealth Management and Trust Division, has developed a relationship with the Hartford office of Morgan Stanley, who attended one of the meetings we had. In fact, they knew this was on the agenda tonight. Should we come? I said, no decisions are being made tonight, and I know we had other things to address. And so I think, obviously they will be a respondent. We have not talked whatever fees are involved there, but, yeah.
Okay, great. And then last, I'll address to the chairman. And I hope I'm not confusing this with a different topic, but every budget year, I know you have a particular sticking point about the percentage that goes into the budget for revenue on our investments. So I'm curious if the investment subcommittee had thought about I'll use the word better way, not that we have a bad way, but a way that might be a little more conducive to an easier environment during the budget process.
Actually, I was going to ask Tom if I could have the floor for one more time, and that
Yep.
was literally what I was going to bring
Oh, great.
up.
Well, then
So-
please take it
But before I
over.
do that, Paul, can I make one small suggestion related to Mary's request? You gave a description that was useful about, she asked about the nature of the account at People's Bank when we retitled it to get the coverage. I'm pretty sure, I'm hoping that if you called our representative over there, they probably have a tear sheet or some data sheet that they could give us that gives us an explanation. I'd like to see that myself, actually. If you could get a hold of that and forward it to all of us, that would be appreciated.
I have an old draft letter from Dave Weber, who is our primary contact. in the
Whatever you
municipal
have.
banking
Yeah,
department.
whatever it is, and whatever,
Yeah.
it's something official, not really a typed thing from him, but preferably a formal thing from the bank. And to Mr. DeWitt's point, I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think it is really important, and it's a good time right now, given that the budget season is soon to be on us. I think part of the problem with this account, personally, and this is nobody's fault, I'm not casting any aspersions on anyone, either present or former, that creating a budget for this account is part of what has caused us to have some issues with the account, because it is very unfair to have somebody responsible for managing an account putting a number out there publicly and saying, now you've got to essentially try and meet this, right? Because by definition, otherwise you wouldn't have a budget. And and I think that's caused us in some cases to reach for yield. And in fact, in the past, Paul's told some stories that would scare you. Before Paul was here, some reaching for yield ended up being very, very disastrous. So I personally don't think there should be any budget for this line, personally. I'm sure I'm not going to get happy smiles from others on that. I think the interest rates now are virtually zero, and anything we get off this account is gravy, in my opinion. That doesn't mean I'm right or I have to be listened to, but certainly a far lower number than is currently in the budget from last year would be recommended. And we could come up with a number that's more reasonable based on the current interest rate environment.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the subcommittee procedurally, because I said, I
did.
know especially you, Mr. Brockfeld, are very vocal about the numbers that we come up with every year.
And-
And if we could have a process that would maybe,
No, it's a fair
Help
point.
squelch
And
that,
and in one of
you
the
know,
rare cases
you know.
for me, I've been right on this one, I'm sorry to report. We've come in way below.
Right.
So.
Yeah, right.
So, yeah, again, if it was up to me, and I'm not the one who has to deal with the repercussions, I don't think there should be a budget for this. But if there's going to be one, there's probably a number much lower that's representative of today's interest rate environment. And by the way, to finish up, one of the answers we'll get is when we start interviewing cash management firms and find out what their thoughts are about what is a realistic return on the account. That would give us a much better guess when we come up with a budget than just pulling something out of thin air, which I think we've kind of done in the past.
Any other questions, comments, concerns on this item? Mr. Tetro, Mr. Hiller, anything to add to this? All right, any questions, comments from the public on this item? Seeing none. All right. We'll move along to hear and consider a report from the Budget Subcommittee of the Board of Finance. This was tabled from the December 13th meeting. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Bolito in his committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. First of all, I want to thank my colleagues Bob Stone and Chris DeWitt, who, as usual, did a stellar, terrific job. We have done this now for 2 years, and I think we have got a good handle on the process, what works, what needs improvement. So I'll just kind of zip through it as quickly as I can here. Everyone has the meeting minutes in front of them, I'm assuming. First of all, what was good? And there was a lot that was good. First thing is the Munis budget sheets. This has been a godsend for us because it's been able to give us consistent information that is readily available and updatable, and particularly the fact that the Board of Ed has finally got on board with the Munis program, and we're getting some similar type sheets from them so we can compare apples to apples, oranges to oranges. That's very helpful. Electronic materials beforehand. Basically, we started pushing a couple of years ago to get the supporting documentation delivered to this board via email and PDF format, and that's been very helpful because obviously being a volunteer board, having the information at hand beforehand so we can review it's been very helpful. Schedule breaks and time cap for meetings. We're human, and when we're going to 12 and 1 in the morning as we used to, it's impossible to keep paying attention as much as we try. So I think the fact that we've kind of put a limit on our discussion, said, look, guys, after 11, we're done, and that's it, I think it's been very helpful. And it's also helped the presenters to kind of get a handle on, all right, we need to quicken things up. This is what you really need to know. Leadership. Mr. Flynn has done a stellar job, as did Mr. Kiley before him, in terms of handling the vast number of presenters that we have at all these meetings, and the public, the fact that it can be a very emotional time for people, and the fact that we are just taking such a volume of information and getting it together. So it's been very helpful. Level of discussion. I think the fact that we have such a varied group of professionals on this board, and that we have different expertise, different things that we bring to the table, it helps us to elevate the discussion level of this board, and I think that helps the town as a whole. Revenue projections coming first in the process. This was a change we made a couple of years ago, and I think it's been very helpful because before you get into the whole expense side of things, it's good to know what you got coming in. And in years past, at least the first year that I was on the board, it kind of got lost in the shuffle. And when you're in the midst of a budget process, it's very difficult to focus on something like that. So by putting it first, knowing what you got coming in, it makes the whole discussion of what's going out a little bit easier to handle. Food, yeah, that's always good, having the donuts and all the goodies. We're thinking of upping that and maybe getting some, maybe some shrimp or things like that, maybe some appetizers here for next year. And attendance. This board cares about what we're doing, as do all the town boards and bodies. And I think the fact that I think attendance was pretty much perfect along the way through the budget process. So that was excellent as well. All right, what was bad? RTM attendance. Proviso, it was better this past year. I think they got a rotation going where we had a couple of 2 or 3 people rotating in and out. The thing is that we get the same group of people coming every time. I look out at Mr. Becker, Mr. Ambrose, and a few other people who are here all the time, and having maybe some of the newer folks coming in, some different people, I think it would be good in terms of helping them get on board with what's going on, and also it would make those who come to all of our meetings, would make their wives a lot happier having them home a little bit more often, so that's a good thing. Non-recurring capital allocations early did not affect the outcome. The process is still broken. We have been trying to get we used to call it non-recurring, now we call it capital improvement projects, get them out of the budget process, because what happens is, again, in the cauldron of the budget season, some things get short shrift, and this is one of those things that's important. You're talking about major expenditures, items that need to be done, capital items, and we wanted to try to do it earlier in the process and vote on it earlier in the process so that we could really focus our attention on the budget once we started that. We kind of got there in terms of the presentations, but then with the introduction of the TFC, it just slowed that to a halt. We need to figure out how to incorporate the TFC into this process and get that vote done before we begin the budget process. Still lots of painful data, and what I mean by that is, and what we mean by that is, sometimes we go into excruciating detail about things, and while a certain level of detail is good, when you're one of maybe 10 departments on a given night, you know, a big picture, broad view is a good thing. Still no good charity approval format. This has been vexing us for quite some time, the charitable contributions. There are some things that apparently by state statute we have to do. Those should be separated out. That should not be a difficult thing to do. But then with the other charities, we never had a formal process and format for who gets on the list, how did they get on the list. If a charity's out there that wants to get town contributions, how do they get on the list? Should we even be doing this at all? Those are all discussions that have been had. There was a subcommittee formed that for one reason or another, and I'll let Mr. DeWitt speak to it when we get there with recommendations, it just kind of got slowed down and stopped. So we'd like to get to a point where we have a formal policy in place and we know what the rules of the game are, why those charities are on board. And also, data continues not to be reconciled. It's been better, but too often we get data that, you know, we get one thing in our budget book, we get a sheet that's handed out to us at the meeting, and sometimes the data is inconsistent, sometimes things are forgotten. Again, it's just one of those things that we need to keep an eye on. It's gotten better, appreciably better, but we need to keep improving that. So, future actions and recommendations. First one I alluded to just now, close on the charity approval process, getting on and off. Mr. DeWitt's the chairman of that subcommittee. Did you want to briefly talk about that and where it stands?
Were you the chairman, Chris? Or
I was the chairman, yeah. There was, in fact, there was only one, there was only, the committee was so small, we only had one person, that was me. It
No,
was
there
a-
was the, there were
There were
other
no
town
vice
body
chair,
members.
there.
Right.
Yes, and that's been part of the problem. Our committee is gone 30 different ways. I mean, Ms. Stenick is no longer a selectman. Ms. McCarthy-Vahey is now a selectman. I'm trying to think who else was on there. Was Ken, were you? Ken was on, right, so we're still constant. We did have we did right up until almost the time we were going to give our subcommittee meeting, consensus on how we were going to, or approvals we were going to make to this body and to the Board of Selectmen, and last minute turned right around. So we need to, I will take the action to ask again for the town bodies to offer a person up, Board of Selectmen, the RTM, and the Board of Finance, and we will do this right the next time, doing this short process.
Mr. Tetra, can you and Mr. DeWitt touch base and perhaps go about reconstituting the committee?
I know Kristen has a passion for being on here. I just don't know if she has the time constraint, so.
If you guys could do that. My only concern is, one of the reasons we asked for this
Yeah.
committee to be formed and across the various town bodies was to give enough time to the charities so that they would understand. And now, quite frankly, we're in the same position we were in last year.
You're absolutely right.
So, but I would ask that it be reconstituted and,
Yep.
that you continue building off the good work you've already done
I will do that.
and using that to the extent that you can.
Tom?
Yes.
Just one comment as a member of that committee and in defense of Mr. DeWitt, who actually took it very seriously and worked diligently. We got caught up in a number of issues. I think the train station got, sucked a lot of oxygen out of the air. And also, this is a more complicated subject than even I realized when I joined up, because there is this issue of very subjective local charitable organizations, which would probably be easier to deal with in terms of a policy. And then there was much more objective stuff in terms of state requirements and stuff that we kind of had to do, and we got a lot of benefit out of, and we were really having a hard time getting answers on a lot of those issues. So just in Mr. DeWitt's defense, it's actually a little more complicated than we originally thought.
And my understanding was that the committee was just about to release a series of recommendations, and then it kind of got pulled back because some of the people were having misgivings. Is that a fair statement?
Two of our members were I don't know what the right word is. They weren't ready. Yeah, they changed their mind, basically. But Mr. Brockfeld is correct. There's a lot of things going on here, and it's a very personal thing. People take this very, very personally.
Well, and I think that was one of the reasons we had thought that a formal approval process needed to be put in place.
Right.
To take some of the subjectivity out of it, to clarify for the charities themselves.
Yes.
What the game plan was.
Right.
And to also make it a fair and level playing field for everyone, as opposed to what personal preference might be of people in positions of authority.
Right. And if I get out of the blocks fast enough, I think if we can reconstitute some part of the team, right, get the new team members in, go over the recommendations we've already kind of established. I think for the budget process, because one of the things we were in pretty much agreement that the bodies that we had to give money to, the Greater Bridgeport Transit Authority, they're mandated, right? That should be part of the budget process. It's a mandated number. It goes in the budget book. We don't discuss it. It's like paying the light bill. $2 million, go ahead, do it. I mean, I think we can do that pretty quickly, and I think we can do that in time for the budget process. That would be at least a step in the right direction, and then the more complicated subjects that Mr. Brockfeld alluded to might be pushed off a little bit.
Great. Does anybody else have any questions or comments or concerns on this? Lane?
Can I just get a kind of a clarification? Was this subcommittee formed in order to give a concise opinion of what charities were going to be allowed in the budget and make the budget process move faster?
You know, the subcommittee charter was to investigate how, first off, that there were two basic fundamental kind of charities, mandated and non-mandated, right? The non-mandated ones are what I would really call a charity, something that we are not obligated to, again, contribute to.
Okay.
But the subcommittee was also chartered with the real charities. What is the process for which a charity gets on the list, gets off the list, is maintained on the list? You know, it had appeared some charities were on there for a long time. They were just getting a check every year. And every year we would sit here and go, why is, Joe's Charity still on there, So it was to establish a policy to make sure that at least this body felt comfortable about where that money was going.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. DeWitt. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Mr. DeWitt. Moving along, another future action recommendation we had was to add prior year bonding resolutions as background for the new capital improvement projects. Now, I know that there's been some discussion at the Board of Selectmen level, or will be, about this. Basically, what we want to do is to track projects and basically have a sense of where we are with them on an ongoing basis. What happens is we approve a project, there's a bonding resolution that goes out, and then we kind of lose track of it. And sometimes cost overruns happen, and we need to be on top of these things, and we can only do that if we get the information on an ongoing basis. So a couple of discussion points on that. Should the Town Facilities Committee be involved in all of these types of projects? That's something we need to talk about across all the town boards and bodies. And then another discussion point is, We really would like to have the list to the TFC by October, give them 30 days to review, and then have a final report to the Board of Selectmen for their December meeting, and then on to the Board of Finance for the budget process. We need to have a timetable in place, because what happened this past year was that the Town Facilities Commission got on board kind of late in the game, and they had an unfair burden. They had a lot of projects to look at in a very short amount of time. So we think by having a set timetable and doing it early in the process, it makes it more fair. We're going to get a more thorough analysis, and it helps everybody do their job a little bit better. So, items that are before the Board of Finance shortly after the budget process is closed, that's got to stop. We've had, I can't tell you how many times where we get the budget process done and then bing, oh yeah, here's this project we have to do. And we're kind of like, well, why wasn't that included in the budget process? So we're saying that all CIP projects that are long-term must be presented at budget time. Any major capital expenditures over $5 million or infrastructure-related improvements, that could be presented any time, because obviously that's something that comes up and you really can't help it. And also emergency projects can be presented any time. So those would be two exceptions. But other than that, people know what's coming down the pike. It should be included in the budget process so it can be fully vetted as part of that process. The Budget Subcommittee report should be recurring as the first agenda item in June meeting. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can we touch base back on the
Yeah.
the capital improvement projects before you move on? One of the things that we discussed and asked for coming out of our planning summit in September was a joint committee to be put together amongst the town boards to review, in fact, the entire capital improvement approval process. I know the Board of Education has had numerous frustrations with getting projects approved. I know the TFC, as you correctly point out, has been put in an unfair situation with projects coming to them last minute, them being kind of the court, if you will, of rendering a verdict on a product or an opinion on a project, rather. So I think the first selectman has gone about putting together that committee. I don't want to speak for him if he wants to come up to the mic. I have, at the request of the first selectman, appointed a representative from our board to that committee. It should be Mr. Brown, who I think I notified you all that I'd asked him to serve in that capacity. So, Mr. Tetro, being that this is being addressed now, I think for the second year, and I think we attempted to make some improvements last year, but then the whole TFC involvement came along.
Right. We originally were scheduled to vote on the CIP items before the budget process, and then when the TFC came aboard, which, by the way, was not a bad idea, it just kind of came in late in the game.
Right.
That kind of threw a monkey wrench in the whole thing, so that we ended up voting on it, I believe, as part of the budget process, and the whole point was to get it out so that we could really give it the attention it deserves.
Right. Now I think the other town bodies are kind of on board with that, and I think this whole idea of the subcommittee is to address these issues as well as numerous other issues in terms of the timing of it. So over to the first selectman.
Yeah, simply, we're going to take a look at kind of two perspectives, but probably the biggest one in terms of here is what the building project kind of process is, at what point, and frankly, what role the TFC is, because that's a lot of the things that they're being asked to do are in some respects inappropriate. Certainly from a workload standpoint, we dump those things on them, but they, you know, as you step through what they have, from Ludlow windows to Ward roofs to multi-roof things to the Sherman School project at the time, if you looked at what the workload was that that group of people had, and they meet once a month, that's not fair. It's not fair, and we dump those things on them without their approval to accept them or a time frame back from them in terms of when we get them through, or frankly, a clear understanding of what we expect them to do with those items. So I think the committee's going to take a look at all of the above. And we may have to be a little bit flexible in terms of how we do things during this process, but I would expect that certainly in time for the next budget process, we should have those things on board. With your permission, Mr. Chair, I would take time to point out that at least one of the recommendations, major capital expenditures greater than $5 million, our non-recurring budget, and I'm probably going to do my best to get us back to that, because that seemed to be clearly, we all understood what that is. We keep referring to capital improvements, that old non-recurring. It's like, let's just call it non-recurring and cut the new name out, because that doesn't relate. We basically have what we call capital expenditures that are within the operating budget. You see those at the end of the department. We have non-recurring, which is this group of smaller items between, based on our revised bonding requirements or guidelines, between 100,000 and $1 million. Those are the things we kind of package together, look at as a group. There's no law that says we have to do it that way. We choose to do it that way. It's our policy. That's why I look at item 2 here and say if it's really greater than $1 million, becomes a item for us to look at as a separate project. And again, that's our guideline. We can change that anytime we want, but that's our guideline that we've tried to follow in the past. So I'd look at it from that standpoint, and I would suggest we just start calling it non-recurring, because that's really how we always refer to it, regardless of what's written down.
Fair points.
What's the time for, is the committee formed now? Do you have
Yes.
representatives from all the bodies?
And we have a meeting scheduled.
When's the meeting scheduled?
Mr. Brown, to the mic, please.
Yes. The meeting's scheduled for January 10th, 5 o'clock,
Obviously lobbying for the secretarial position.
Tuesday. Not so fast on that.
I don't think anybody lobbies for that.
But we do, everybody has stepped up.
Do you have
The
a?
only thing that kind of held us up moving fast, we talked after the fire-delayed orientation of this
Right.
board, and then we hit the holiday season, so we've tried to get it back on board and on track as soon as we can there.
Do we have any time frame for their deliverables or anything, or is that all to be determined?
I think we need the first meeting to do that. I would kind of, my thoughts are twofold. One is that there's some short-term things I think we can address pretty quickly based on thoughts we had, kind of the low-hanging fruit, let's address this, this, and this. I think based on how the discussion goes, there may be some longer-term issues we bring up that just may need more time, but until the committee gets together the first time, I don't know quite how to draw the line there.
Okay. We have a quarterly review scheduled later in January. Mr. Brown, if you could report back to us on anything you've learned from the first meeting, and if you guys do, in fact, develop timelines or anything, I think it would be important for us to know what they were, particularly as we are going to be going into another budget season, and obviously this is going to be a work in process and not necessarily fully operational for us for the budget season. Great.
Yeah, and again, I think there are enough pieces that have been developed over time by various committees, including the Town Building Projects Committee that you served on, I think, 6 years ago.
Yeah.
In your youth.
Yeah.
That we can pull
Still
those
in my
pieces.
youth.
Yeah.
He's not
Compared to some others.
Some of us aren't 60 yet.
Yes. But we can pull together, I think, some of those pieces and kind of fill in the blanks in terms of getting through that. So I'm hoping that this won't be a long, lengthy process. I just don't see us getting through it in time to have a major impact on this budget season.
Great. Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Thank you, Mr. Bolito, for giving me the time. Go ahead.
Absolutely. Good points. Almost at the end here. The Budget Subcommittee report. We want to try to get this going as a first agenda item in the June meeting of each year, where it's a little bit far enough away from the budget process so that we can take a good look at it, but it's fresh enough in our minds so that we're not forgetting stuff, which does happen from time to time. It forces the process and allows time to implement change before we get into the next budget cycle. E, which is an important one, and we actually have a policy to go along with this. Our goal is that by 2013, we would like this board to be almost entirely paperless. What we're looking to do is, with the exception of the big budget book and some of the larger budget documents, we want to be in a position where we're not getting a whole lot of this stuff, where we all have access to laptops, Kindles, e-readers, tablets, some sort of e-reading device. There's no reason with the technology that's out there and our ability to use it that we can't get all of the smaller documentation in a virtual manila envelope that's emailed to us so we can review it and have it here at our desk. I think it would save the town maybe some money, and it's one of the things we're looking to do is maybe do a cost-benefit analysis to take a look at how much money could we save if we start just doing electronic delivery rather than putting everything on paper. So you'll find on the next page we have a proposed document delivery policy. It's a 3-item policy, and we would like this at some point to be a voting item, not tonight because we have other things to do. But first is commencing January 1st, 2012, or a little bit beyond that now. All documents submitted to the Board of Finance for their consideration shall be delivered electronically in PDF format no later than 24 hours prior to a scheduled meeting. 2, said documents shall be emailed to board members in a virtual manila envelope that shall be labeled with the prefix BOF and a suffix containing the meeting date at which said documents are to be considered. And then 3, this policy is subject to the following exceptions, and a hard copy may be substituted where A, the clerk and chairman of the Board of Finance jointly determine that a document is too large to be feasibly delivered in electronic format, like the budget book, for example, and B, a board member specifically requested a document be made available to them as a hard copy, but this exception shall expire on December 3rd, 2013, which would be our organizational meeting next year. We think it's a good policy because we can set an example for the other town boards and bodies in terms of saving some paper and getting with the 21st century. I could tell you that in my profession, virtually everything we do now is electronic. Court pleadings are done electronically, and you have to do it that way. It's not an option anymore. So if a staid professional like mine could get with the program, I think that town government can as well. And given the fact that we're a 9-member board, relatively electronically savvy, I think it's a good step in the right direction for the future. Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions, comments, or concerns on that proposed policy? Yeah, Mr. Kylie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to the committee for all this great work. I know how much work and effort went into this for the second year, and we've made some great improvements in our process. Couple quick things. This electronic policy is very important, as well as near and dear to my heart, and I fully, completely support it as soon as we can possibly do it. It does lead me to another pet peeve of mine that we still seem to have, and that is we are still continually inundated with paper the night of a meeting, the handouts. And that's a combination of two things. Number one, it not being electronic or it becoming electronic, which we can handle, but it's the preparedness aspect of it. We just aren't getting things in a timely fashion that we need to read, understand, react to, while we're listening to people talk about them and ask intelligent questions and make decisions. It's just a practice that I think needs to go away. So, and I don't know where that would fall into this policy. It's actually something that's, evident at meetings beyond the budget sessions, but it's just something we haven't been able to get away from. And
I think the first time this came up was 6 years ago. First time it came up for me was 6 years ago. One of the former members of the board requested that we not consider any paper that was handed out at a meeting.
The senior.
Right.
Yeah.
And
The senior, Mr. Flynn.
yeah, and I think we do need to try to push for that policy.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. And in the first item on the policy, it said shall be delivered electronically no later than 24 hours prior.
Right.
We had talked about 48, to be quite honest with you, but we
Right.
realized that there are some things in a changing world that information needs to be updated. But yeah, I mean, we're a volunteer board, as our colleague Mr. Tetra often pointed out, and for us to really give things a fair hearing, we need to have the information before us so that we can review it. And when we're getting a stack of stuff the night of, it's just impossible to concentrate on what you need to be concentrating on. And you got papers, you're trying to, what's this, what's that, somebody's talking. It's impossible to do business properly in that type of environment. So I think it comes down to enforcement, basically saying, look, we don't get it 24 hours before, we don't consider it. That's it. Unless there's some extenuating circumstance where information is new that we need to have to deliberate on something. But other than that, 24 hours ought to be enough time.
I think, barring any other questions, comments, or concerns with this policy, I think what I'm going to ask is, Mr. Hiller, if you could touch base with Mr. Bolito and Mr. Bolito, members of your committee as you see fit, and vet any issues that the administration might have with the implementation of the policy, and come back to us with if it's feasible, and then we can turn around and adopt the policy. But I do want to give you the opportunity to respond to it, and to make sure that you're able to comply. And it's something that both sides can live with, okay?
I've actually started the cost-benefit analysis, and Mr. Brockville will find this interesting. Killing two birds with one stone, Twig and I, Twig went out, her people went out and did an internet search for Kindles, and to see, because I thought, listen, if we had 9 new Kindles at $150 or whatever how long would it take to save that much printing and paper and postage? And I know Mr. Hiller showed up at my door the other day, his gas money to show up at my front door and drop off paperwork, right? And we're working through that now, but we have used our, and we're going to use that as an example of one of the internet searches that you were questioning about the purchasing policies.
Good.
So, we've started the process already.
Any other questions, comments, concerns?
Mr. Stone, did you have anything you wanted to add? Because you were an integral part of the committee.
No, I think you really covered it. I really don't.
Okay, cool.
I think, Mr. Kiley said getting the stuff on time is crucial. I'm really in favor of the electronic delivery. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm really in favor of the electronic delivery, and I think we should really start it as soon as possible, even as an experimental thing to see if it works. So I think it can save a lot of money, and at least we have the stuff beforehand.
Great.
Without this kindling that I call it.
Kindling. Thank you. All right, nice job. Thank you for your work on that committee. We appreciate it. I know as well that Mr. Bolito is already working with Mr. Hiller on putting together, we have the meeting scheduled for the budget process, but now it's a matter of assigning the departments to the specific nights, and I know they're working on that now, and I hope to get that back later this month.
Yeah, we actually have a draft ready to go. The only thing we're talking about is, A, when are we going to vote on the non-recurring stuff? And B, we're toying around with the idea of splitting the administrative departments into 2 nights rather than doing them all in one night, because we do have an extra discussion night in the schedule right now. We could probably use that for taking half of the administrative items separately. So other than that, we've got it pretty well squared away.
Great. Thank you very much. Any questions, comments on that? Seeing none, we'll go to the public for any comments on this item. Haven't gone. Yes, Mr. Becker.
Walking up with his iPad.
What's that?
Said walking up with your iPad.
There you go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David Becker, District 1. There's a couple of things. On the RTM side, I agree with you, and I, as somebody who's here all the time at these meetings, I would as well like to see that this attendance go up. I'm hoping with the new term, with new memberships on each side, hopefully some of the changeover will help that. I do think that one of the problems that I've experienced, that I think some members have found the meetings in a way to be, I don't want to entirely say a turnoff, but to some degree they do come to a few and say it's not worth staying, is that there is some inconsistency that happens at the meetings in regards to when they can ask questions or when they can speak, and sometimes it happens on some items. And I know that you do try as chair, Mr. Flynn, to move the agenda on. It's difficult with everybody, but perhaps there's a way to make this somewhat more inclusive. There's a variety of ways to go about that. Maybe it was streamlined in advance, something to that effect, but that might help a little bit with the membership. I think when they feel like they come, they sit here for 5 hours, 2 nights a week for a month straight and don't say a word, and and then almost repeat it sometimes, or have to go to the department heads the next day. It can make them go, well, then why didn't I just go ask my question the next day with the department head on my own? So, I'd be happy to get any direct feedback you want, at least with my caucus, or sit down with anybody, the budget committee, at any point in time that you want to discuss this. But that would be something I think that could be a little bit of a driver, in that this is the Board of Finance, and then the RTM has, obviously does have their process as well, and there are some discussions as to how we're going to potentially better that on our end. But in a sense, it's not always viewed, I think, as the town's budget process, and maybe in a way it is. As well, on the electronic, I agree with you. That's something that we're looking at on the RTM. We actually spoke with the town clerk a little bit about this. There's some things within our rules that actually stipulate that we have to get it, but we're thinking potentially with that, if there's a request, something along those lines for year to year, like Mr. Kiley would like as well, for all the agendas. Obviously, I'm somebody who scans them and never wants to touch the paper again. So I agree. One of the suggestions that I would have would be to include, again, RTM on that, or even just simply the public, if there was a folder like that, to have that up on the web 24 hours in advance as well. I think one of the things that certainly I find troubling during the process is that there's a lot of documentation that you get sometimes mailed, or they drop it on your seat when you get here, and then I've got to either go chase the department heads the next day, or I go to Paul if he has it. But it is definitely difficult, and there's often not enough paper and they got to make more copies. It's a problem, and I think, again, that might help include more RTM, which I think helps the process, and the public as well, by being a little bit more streamlined in advance. One suggestion that I know that Kristen McCarthy-Vahey has said, and I think twice now, actually, has been to cite on all the documentation in the corner what department, who produced it, the date it was, produced. I mean, those types of citings, even if in electronic form, I think it's something that we need. Because at the end, you end a budget season with, that much paper and that many books, and you're not sure who it's from, and that, I think, is oftentimes, especially if it started off at the Board of Finance in February and it's an RTM document that I'm dealing with the first week of May, and it can certainly be, a bit of a problem. I think that's it for now, but certainly, again, I'd be glad to talk about any of those at a budget meeting if you'd have me. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Becker. I want to respond to one comment, and that's about the inclusiveness. Number one, with the exception, I think, of one or two budget hearings, I think there's two. There's one when we go into executive session for it's just discussion and we don't allow public comment, and there's another one when we actually go into voting and we don't allow public comment. At every other budget session, there is actually public comment that's allowed and encouraged, and there's time given at each budget hearing for that. What I will not allow is questions, because if I open it up for members of the public to ask questions of the department heads, number one, that's not fair to the department heads. Number two, meetings that routinely start at 7 and go to 11 could not possibly accomplish the information that we want if we have to allow 30, 40, 50, 60 members of the public to get up and ask questions with the expectation that there's going to be a response to those questions. So, comments, yes. Questions, no. That's part of the process. That's the way it has to be. I'm sorry if that frustrates anybody, but at least as I run the meetings, it would be my intention to continue that policy as we move forward. And I don't know if anybody has any questions, comments, or concerns on it. So thank you very much, and I couldn't agree with you more on the documentation side of your commentary. Okay. Seeing nothing else on that item, we'll move along to item number 4, which is to receive and consider the comprehensive annual financial report, CAFR, for the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2011, as prepared by J.H. Cohn, our certified public accountants. I'm going to turn it over. Welcome, Mr. Sanchafani. Good to see you again.
We need to move, right?
We need to move. We've been told to move and move our chairs. There you go.
Does everybody have a copy?
Joe Corey said move.
Make a better door than a window.
Yeah, I'm going to go in the front. Yeah, right.
Just takes a minute. Here you go. All right, thanks. Stand, Mr. Lane. Minutes?
That's why you got an engineer.
I'll try.
All right. All set?
All set, thanks.
All right. All right, so we're going to walk through these things. Everyone should have the 3 documents in addition to this in hard copy, at least for this year. So we're going to walk through, give an overview of the audit, going to talk about the various reports that were issued, look at the recommendations, the required communications, and some of the things that are coming up in the future related to GASB and those type of things. All right. Yep. Okay, the reports that were issued. Again, the 3 different documents. The comprehensive annual financial report is the light blue one. Federal and state single audit is the white one. SAS 114 communications and the recommendations are in the dark blue. So starting with the light blue one, the CAFR, the opinion on financial statements is on page 8. Again, it's unqualified, clean opinion, no problems or scope limitations that would change the opinion. On page 10 starts the management discussion analysis. This is written by management by Paul. It's a good executive summary, again, of what happened during the fiscal year and the difference between the changes from last year to this year. So talk about fund balance. We'll talk a lot about fund balance tonight because things have changed. Again, internal service funds on page 14. Again, these are the financials, so we'll look at those in more detail. The general fund budgetary operations, again, discussed on page 15. Then capital assets, any of the major changes there, and the long-term debt, any changes from prior year also. So again, I recommend everyone read that in detail. We'll talk about the highlights, but that's, again, will give you a good flavor of what happened during the year. So notable changes from last year's report. Point out Exhibit B on page 20. Because of the unique project that the railroad station project was, you'll see that that's been added as a function, right above interest expense on Exhibit B. So that's separated out because, in general, most of that is not going to be an asset of the town. So most of that project is ending up at an expense of the town. GASB 54 was implemented. This is the new fund balance. Talked about it the last couple of years. When we look at Exhibit C, we'll see the different fund balance categories. So it went from 3 basic categories to 5 categories. And then we'll also look at the footnote. Gives a detail of what the certain restrictions are for what function, restrictions, commitments. And then the railroad station project note is new this year, related to the authorization issue that everyone is well aware of. That's on page 40, which if you look at shows a big over expenditure for that line, and the note explains that situation. Going to page 21, again, Exhibit C focusing on the general fund. Unassigned, it's a new category. We used to talk about unreserved. Now the category is called unassigned. Still looking at for 5 to 15%. And you can see your trend that you've increased the last couple years. Your unassigned fund balance has gone up. So you're at 5.36%. June 30, 2007. This chart shows total fund balance. So we'll see a couple more slides. So your total fund balance went up the 1.6, but the unassigned went up a smaller amount. So again, your total fund balance has been on a good trend since 2009. Been steadily increasing. Again, look at the components of fund balance. Again, committed, which is your encumbrances. The assigned, which is when was your designation when you use budget, when you use some of fund balance to balance the budget. And then the unassigned, again, showing a good trend is the yellow bar. General fund operations, looking at page 23, this on the GAAP basis. So your unassigned increased for the year, the 1.638 from operations. Encumbrances increased this year, so that reduced your undesignated by that difference, getting us to the 13.4 million that we just looked at on those charts. So again, positive operations for general fund of the 1.6. On a budgetary basis, looking at page 26, net increase in fund balance was 1.478. The difference from GAAP is the increase in encumbrances and an accrued payroll entry that was done for GAAP and not for budget. You know, looking at the fourth column on Exhibit F, revenues were short by 55,000, but that was offset by spending savings of the 1,474. So basically, your increase in fund balance came from your spending savings last year. Internal service funds on page 27 through 29. Total of all funds had an operating income was the 1.183. So that was better than the last several years. The major contributing factor was a decrease in some of the liabilities for workers' comp and medical. You know, that totaled 664,000 of that 1.2. So half of that was from decrease in liability, which is a good trend. Workers' comp hasn't decreased in a long time. So the fund deficit, again, you're still total fund deficit of the 4,738,000. But as we talked about in prior years, the long-term portion of liability is the 5,888. So your deficit is less than the long-term portion of liability. So from that perspective, I think you're in reasonable shape. The rating agencies, you still want to see all positive numbers, but last year I think you were only about 192 positive. So you're definitely going in the right direction. So again, just to remind, the internal service funds includes the activity for workers' compensation, the general and property liability, town and Board of Ed active medical, and Board of Ed retiree medical, which is still an internal service and not in the trust funds that we'll see in a few minutes. The pension funds, the detailed financial statements are in the footnotes on 56 and 57. So we look at the increase in net assets for the town plan. You're up to $22 million. Of that, most of it all was a change in fair value. For the police and fire, your increase was $19.4 million. Again, change in fair value was $23 million, but because of the contribution level, the benefits paid out were higher than, so that's why it's not the same level, and you actually went, even though you had a total increase, your cash more went down versus your change. So the decrease in the funded ratio, and it's on page 54, town went from 104.5 to 101.1, so even with the good change in fair market value, as we've mentioned in previous years, you are using the smoothing method, so there's a 5-year smoothing of those gains, and you're still, so these gains aren't really affected in that analysis as far as the funding level, and we're still amortizing the losses of the last several years into that. So that should level out in another 2 years, but again, you're still over 100% funded, which is a very good position. So again, that takes into account the smoothing. If we just look at the fair value, the market value, the town plan is 92% funded, looking at the market value of your investments, so, and that's up quite a bit. And police and fire is about 81% funded, down a little bit, again, because your benefits are more than your contributions and investment income at this point. So even just at the fair value, ignoring the smoothing, you're still in pretty good shape. the OPEB funds, other post-employment benefits, and this is just the retiree medical. So on page 61, it shows the change in the liability. So the town liability went up by 700,000, police and fire went up by about 1.3, and the Board of Ed went up about 900, about $1 million. As far as your required contribution meeting that 100% level, because that's what's driving that liability, is the town's not contributing 100% what the actuary is recommending, so therefore that liability is increasing. Town is at 87%, so up from 75. Police and fire is at 78%, up from the 62, and Board of Ed's at 42%, up from 38. The Board of Ed plan is not a funded plan. It is part, again, as I mentioned, the internal service fund and not part of the trust funds. And that's due to the nature of that liability where it kind of levels itself out over time. Again, I think we've talked about this. I think this is since your 12 budget is adopted. Your commitment to fully fund, so you're at 80%. So hopefully your 2012 budget is going to get you to 100% funding. The other thing I just wanted to point out quickly that, based upon your discussion about investment policy, there's a lot of footnotes in here on investment policy. There's also, in the policy notes, it describes what the state statutes allow a town to invest in. So if you're looking for information on that, that's in the policy notes. But just to point out, since you are developing a policy, there's a couple things that you are addressing indirectly that relate to this. If we look on page 42, in the cash and investment note, we say interest rate risk, credit risk, if the town has no policy to address those. It's a required disclosure to say that you don't have a policy. So as part of your development of the policy, you could address those couple items specifically, and then we can say the town's policy is X. So if you read the notes on there, the couple places where you say you don't have the policy, you might want to incorporate that in, and then we can you remove that statement and put what your policy is. Federal and state single audit, that's the little white book. Same as in prior years, the schedule of federal money spent on page 1 and 2, unqualified opinion on compliance, no findings or question costs. We had no issues with any of the work that we did. The state schedule, same thing, list all the state monies. Unqualified, no findings. The single audit threshold was $437,000, and that's because of the railroad project grant. That large amount drove your threshold up. So just as far as the compliance work that we had to do with that, again, that is included in as far as the spending, that we had no problems or question costs with those monies. The required communications, and starting in this blue package. So the SAS 114 letter is the first section that just describes the accounting policies, what's different from last year. Again, GASB 54, as we mentioned, is what's a new policy this year. There's no other significant changes in policies other than that from the prior year. We talk about the different estimates that we review as part of the audit. On page 2, it lists those estimates. Again, we have audit procedures that address each of those. No difficulties in performing the audit. The corrected, uncorrected misstatements we'll look at, they're in this package. No disagreements with management. The representation letter that we requested and the town's signed is also presented in here. So I could walk through that, or that's something you can look at. Again, there's nothing any different than last year's as far as those specific items. Again, I want a lot of the entries in here are for the top statements, so they're really conversion entries more than actual journal entries. And then the recommendations start on page 21. So we look at last year's recommendations. Bank reconciliation, recommendation was corrected. The reimbursement grants was corrected. They were properly recorded. Investment classifications, we still need to work on that a little bit, just matching what your trustee and your advisors say the classifications are as far as types of investments. Additional recommendations were provided earlier related to the railroad project earlier in the year. So again, related to GASB 54, in addition to fund balance, it also has a very strict definition of what a special revenue fund is and what the related purpose is. And so what we're recommending is that the board formally approve the special revenue funds that you currently have and what the related purpose is, so it's very clear. Even if that was probably done somewhere in the past, 54 is looking for very specific governing body level approval for things, or it changes your classification of fund balance. So we're recommending that you formally do that again if it was done in the past, to be clear. And then the second part is to update your fund balance policy for GASB 54 definitions, because you do currently have a policy, but it uses all the old terminology. Again, this is a similar slide I had last year. The new categories are non-spendable. Something like a trust says you can't spend this, or inventory. Restricted, either again by a will, a trust, or grants. Committed is something, again, governing body level, where the funds are committed for a certain purpose, and that's where I'm talking about those special revenue funds where you commit park and rec revenue for park and rec programs, those type of things. Assigned, could be encumbrances. They come to the board here, so they end up in the committed category. Assigned also would be if you used, again, fund balance to balance the budget, and then the unassigned, unreserved is the old term. So that fund balance policy that I'm recommending you adopt, it's in your policy notes. It's there as a default policy currently. That says basically it's the spending order of those categories, that you would spend restricted money first, committed money second, assigned money third, and unassigned last. So that's kind of the default policy. Most of my clients have adopted that order, but we had at least disclosed that this year, but you should formally include that in your policy. The things coming up, derivative hedge thing, that hedge funds or hedging instruments, that deals with interest rate swaps. So it just says when there's an issue with a counterparty, what you have to do with that. We'll review and see if that's applicable or not. Here, I don't recall it being applicable currently. Accounting and reporting for service and concession arrangements, that's if you hire a third party to run concessions and they have certain rights, it changes the accounting. Financial reporting entity for component units, that goes back to GASB 14. This is kind of just tweaking the definitions of looking at whether someone or a agency is financially dependent on the town and may force it to be included in the financial statements. Codification is just a codification, kind of like FASB codified everything. GASB kind of did the same thing. And financial reporting of deferred outflows and inflows. So a lot of changing of the terminology. We talk about unearned revenue and deferred revenue and those type of things. They're going to start changing the terminology just to make it, again, much more clear to deferred inflows, deferred outflows going forward. And those are the highlights. Be happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Killing us here.
Thank you once again for the report.
He's a spokesperson for the firm.
He signed the opinion.
Yeah, it's his signature.
The couple of comments here before we go to questions. First of all, the audit committee, this report had to be filed by the end of December with the state, correct?
Correct.
The audit committee of our board had not had time to specifically meet and review this report in detail with the auditors, which was a procedure we had put in place last year. Given the fact that the report was not complete, you were waiting on some information. My understanding is comfort letters from attorneys, correct, was the large gating item.
Right.
With that in mind, and given the GASB pronouncements that you were speaking of that need to be adopted as we move forward, can I ask that the audit committee hold a meeting with our auditors and make sure that you are comfortable in detail with the report, number one, and secondly, they come up with a proposal for the board, working with Mr. Senafani, Mr. Hiller, to adopt these GASB principles, and then we can take that up at a later meeting. Would that be okay, Mrs. Leclerc, as chairman? Thank you. So we'll move forward with that and just take that right off the table right now. So we'll definitely address that issue, but I want to make sure we're able to move forward on that. Do we have any questions or comments from board members on the audit report? By the way, we just received this audit report, I think, late Friday, right? It was delivered to our homes late Friday, and there's several different reports here, so board members might not have had enough time to go through the entirety of the reports. But any questions, comments, concerns from board members on the reports? Mr. DeWitt.
Good evening. On slide 10, insert internal service funds, you say a major contributing factor to this, what are we talking about? There was was a decrease in the workers' compensation. But we just got a presentation 2 weeks ago, right, that I thought workman's compensation was going up dramatically. In fact, the factor almost doubled. So I'm confused how you think there's a big decrease in workman's comp and the workman's comp guy thinks there's a big increase.
Can I address that?
Sure.
Two things. I think when Mr. Perno was in here in December, first off, he was using updated figures as of October 31st.
Okay.
And the NCCI development factors that had been updated in the ensuing dates between June 30th and October 31st have increased. There was a decrease in our liability from June 30th of 10 to June 30th of 11, and I think that's what Mr. Senafani basically refers to, because he's relying on the same figures. The figures that Mr. Perno gave to you are basically 4-month figures updated through that period of time. And there had been an increase over that period of time. That's going to change again between October 31st and June 30th of 12. So it's moving.
So there may be a net decrease in June of 12.
Potentially could be, but I think, I think the big factor that drove it higher was the development factors, particularly on the more current, on the front end of that exposure.
So the workman's compensation, the factor used for the internal service fund is just looked at for your purposes once a year.
Right, I'm just measuring
Right.
at June 30.
Right.
And those loss development factors are, basically, it's a factor of if the claim's initially 100, how many times that amount do you think the town will actually pay?
Right.
The claim is done. So those go up every year, and they're actually done specifically by state, and that really has a huge impact on the liability. So if that went up July 1, that's going to show the opposite trend.
For next year, your next report next
Right,
year.
correct.
Okay. So you're saying, and I forget the gentleman's name.
I'm sorry?
What was the gentleman's name for?
Perno.
Mr. Perno. So he's got up-to-date data.
He was giving you
or he's
figures
giving
that
us
were
a
essentially
4-month
4 months
snapshot.
later, and there's 4 months more experience that he was showing you. And I'm not certain as to how often those figures change, but I know there had the development factor, and this is consistent with what we've had each year over the last several years, and so
Right.
we haven't changed policy.
Okay.
The numbers are the key numbers, which are the development factor and what the experience have been, are constantly changing.
Okay, got it, thank you.
Okay? Mr. DeWitt, any other questions, comments, concerns? All right, I'm going to ask mine then. Can we turn to page 10? And we're going to go down to, I'm sorry, which book? The blue book, the actual CAFR itself. Page 10, fourth bullet point. Just want to confirm here. Talks about the unassigned fund balance for the general fund. It was 13.4 million, or 5.2% of the general fund expenditures. 9.18% increase over the prior year. So this board, in particular, with help from the administration, is taking great pains in paying attention to this number. So in essence, you're saying we're heading in the right direction here, year over year in this number.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
The original, I'll take issue with a comment later in the report in a minute, but we were always led to believe that the credit rating agencies had looked for a 5% undesignated reserve as compared to annual expenditure budget as kind of a marker of a AAA community. My understanding, though, is that that benchmark has either been updated or that we were operating under incorrect information. Is that, can Mr. Tetra or Mr. Hiller address that?
I think on that there is, I hate to say that there's no correct information or something, but I think, that there's targets. And I think we were under 5% for a couple of years in a row. We have obviously, we've gone beyond that at this point in time. I think the thing that the rating agencies, where they've looked at us and say, national averages on AAA are up in the 20% range. Fairfield County Connecticut averages on AAA are in the 10% range. And we are at the lower end, obviously, of that number.
So nationwide, the average is 20%.
Yeah, that's a little deceiving from
Because there's smaller budgets and because.
Yeah, there's some larger,
But the Connecticut average of AAA communities is 10%, and we're at 5%, a little over 5%, which, by the way, was the target we've been, quote-unquote, shooting for. But it's still low as compared to what the credit rating agencies want to say.
We're better. We're better, and there's been significant improvement. As Mr. Tetra points out, we've improved 4 consecutive years as far as this is concerned. I think the interesting slide to me in Mr. Centofanti's handout
is the bar chart.
And the bar chart is, if you look at on page 7 of the bar chart, where you see we've gone from just over 6 million to in 2005 to 13.4 in the current year.
Mr. Tetra?
Yeah, I think that Mr. Chair, we've had this ongoing discussion for the 6 years. I think we both were on the Board of Finance. I think that, and probably with Mr. Kiley and Ms. Leclerc's participation going on far before that. I think it was, we had difficulty getting, as I remember, initially the credit rating agency reports.
Right.
And then we had difficulty getting clear and concise definitions. Simply, as Mr. Hiller pointed out, based on conference calls we had with a number of the first selectmen in the surrounding towns, joint conference calls this summer, a number of things became clear. One is that, as Mr. Hiller mentioned, the average fund balance for AAA towns across the country is 20%. That's not so much a function of their budgets as it is a function of their variable income. What Moody's was clear to point out to us was that in the Northeast, we tend to have property tax as a pretty stable revenue source. You get into things like sales tax, income tax that are prevalent in other parts of the country, you need a larger fund balance because your fluctuations on the revenue side are harder. Yep. So they rate us, Connecticut, if you will, with an average of 10%, equal as 20% someplace else because of the stability of our income stream. It was clear from the comments, though, from the other first selectmen during the course of that conference call, that Moody's for quite a while, and we didn't have the same conference call with S&P, we didn't have it with Fitch, so I can't speak to that. But it was clear from the comments from the other first selectmen, and Paul, I think the comment from Darien and some other towns was that, and this was specifically addressing the watch list categorization of these towns. Hold it, you've told us we've had needed to have a 10%, that was our target, we're there, why are we on the watch list kind of comments. Moody's acknowledged that, the other towns were all in agreement on that. I'd say that wasn't clearly communicated to the Board of Finance during my tenure, I'm going to say probably during our tenure for those of us that go back that far. Not that clearly, that concise. So they are looking for 10%. That's what was quoted by the other towns. Nobody said not to us, not in our call. So that being said, the other point is that with respect to the AAA towns in Connecticut, at 3%, I think we spent between 3 and 4% for most of the last 6 years on that. That is definitely on the lowest end. I think the only reason that we weren't the lowest is Stanford was below that for a stretch. And Mr. Hiller, if I've got that correct.
Stanford and Greenwich, Greenwich
played by funky rules, so that a little bit different concept. They actually, in essence, spent out of savings. Instead of, they've changed their approach, they're going to debt, they are going to have a bit more of a fund balance issue. But previously they had done things differently, so it wasn't an apples-to-apples comparison. But for all the towns that performed the same, Stanford was the one town below us. They were actually downgraded by one of the 3 rating agencies.
Moody's.
So that, I think, leaves us with the lowest fund balance of any of the AAA towns at the moment.
I have, and I will distribute to the board electronically tomorrow, a comparison of the, it's broken out by county, the 10 or 11 now, I guess, with Easton being added, towns in Fairfield County who are ranked AAA. And problem with this, it's now 18 months dated. It's just been released by OPM. It's called the Financial Indicators. And I think the value of it is you can read across and see just where we rank, and you'll see, we're clearly on a percentage basis in the lower quartile.
So we've done a lot of good work here, and we've been focused for a long period of time. And I'm talking collectively. I'm not talking this board. I'm talking collectively the government. To get and maintain that 5% marker. And we've improved that, as the bar chart clearly demonstrates. But in essence, we're not out of the woods yet, because the new information is that the actual target is closer to 10% as opposed to 5% based on what you've learned in the last few months, right?
Yes, and I think that, again, there's no, you can cherry pick any one measure.
Right.
Certainly in things like pension fund, we're much
Way
better shape
over,
than some of the
right.
other towns are. One of the things we found both during Tropical Storm Irene and during the recent snowfall is that rating agencies are now calling up ahead of time. Mr. Hiller had questionnaires to fill out before and after each event, saying what was the damage on your town, what are your reserves, what are you in a position to.
Right.
So from an operational standpoint, we're in much better shape than many of the towns in Connecticut. So I don't mean to paint just one view of the world. You've got to take all that collectively, and certainly when we talk to the rating agencies, we do our best to paint that picture. We don't want to let them look at us just one way either. We want to make sure they include all of our financial strengths that go along with us.
And I think that's a very valid point. And to that point, to the extent that we've received any negative comments from the credit rating agencies over the past several years, those comments have always commented on our fund balance and our reserve level, our internal service fund and our fund balance here.
I believe, Mr. Chair, you're correct. As I remember it, initially the comments were focused on the, and forgive me, Mr. Centrofani, the undesignated fund balance.
Exactly.
In old terminology. And then recently, as of 2 years ago, transferred the internal service fund.
Exactly.
So I think that, good news, bad news. The
Yep.
good news is they recognize we made efforts on the undesignated fund balance to improve that, and that moved the spotlight off to that, onto our internal service fund.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure we were all with the same set of facts, guys, and understood, particularly as we go into budget season, what's at play here. So, thank you, Mr. Tetra. Yes?
Does that lead us, I mean, we've tried to target 5%, right, over the last couple of years, and now we've gotten there. So it says something about our effort to achieve goals that we've set for ourselves, but now we're learning, as you brought up, that the goalposts aren't really where we thought they were. What does that mean for our aspirations and goals?
I think that's a discussion we need to have during the budget process. I think it's one of the items, a major item we need to put on the list. And I think we need to prioritize that as compared to some of our other goals, such as OPEB funding, pension funding, and the other items, the internal service fund that we need to address. These all have to be prioritized.
Yeah, and I think this board has clearly had that discussion over the past few years in terms of how quickly do we address the internal service fund issues, and it was put, and there's no free lunch. I mean, the way to address that is to raise taxes to address that. This board was conscientious in terms of looking at tax increases and saying, in this economy, what's the balance? How much do we increase taxes? How much do we make a contribution? Last year, this board, the Board of Selectmen, went back through and made significant cuts and didn't change the tax rate and put that money into the internal service fund to make up that gap.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Can we go to page 18, please? It's the Town of Fairfield's statement in net assets. I'm assuming, and I haven't looked at the schedule for a while, so please help me out where I make a false assumption. The page 18, is this supposed to be the consolidated balance sheet for all the town accounts?
This is consolidated with capital assets, long-term debt, excluding pension.
Right.
So this is kind of like what a business would leave. You just push it all
Right.
together.
Yeah.
So it's full accrual, again, just like, again, all the long-term assets and liabilities are on A and B.
Yep.
And they're not anywhere behind that.
Okay, so my question would be, if you go to page 21, comparing page 18 to 21, what's included in, where's the difference there? Is 18 supposed to include everything that's in 21?
18 includes everything that's in 21, plus long-term assets and liabilities.
Right.
So if you look at Exhibit C here on page 22,
Yep.
and we're looking at total, we're just going to go equity. 1140 is if you look at the last column on page 21, 1140.
Yep.
254,890 is the number that's on A or B as equity.
Well, here's what I'm trying to figure out. How do I tie the total assets between the two? Is it the 59 plus the 4?
It's the requirements to reconcile equity
Yeah.
and the change in,
So the assets don't tie?
I could give you a worksheet that shows you how, but in the financials,
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest, it's, capital asset activity,
Yep.
and then we add in internal service fund activity, conceptually. And then there's a whole bunch of change in accruals, because in the back, we have modified accrual, we defer the revenue, up top, it's full accrual, so there's, if you read these different lines here in equity on Exhibit C,
Yep.
capital assets, change in accruals, assets of internal service, that's substantially what it is. It's a little bit more detailed than that, but that's the big picture. And then the bottom part is all the long-term liabilities.
Yep.
That get pushed up front, that would be different from C to A.
Where's the, what's, I know it's a small dollar amount, but what's the loan that's referenced on page 18?
On
I was surprised to see a loan there.
a loan receivable,
Yeah. I was just surprised to see that, because typically those, what I was getting to, Joe, was that if this was a consolidated deal and it was just from one fund to another, it would obviously wipe itself out, but this looked like it was from some third party, so I was concerned about that. I didn't know what that was, who we were loaning money to.
I think it's the two things, I think there's CDBG loans, so your CDBG revolving program, I think, has loans. And then the other part might be the parking authority and directly that debt service that they're paying you.
Yeah, what about the, they owed us some money for salaries?
That's the housing authority.
The housing authority.
That
I'm
would
sorry.
be an accounts receivable, because that's more of a current thing. The parking authority and the CDBG loans have a specific repayment schedule, so they get more classified as a loan versus
Can we just confirm what that is, if you don't?
the 58,000?
Yeah, you don't need to do it now, I'm just talking.
Sure.
And then if we go to page 19, the unearned revenue, what is that number? I can't, the 1.8, what does that represent?
On page 19, the other what?
The unearned revenue? 1.8 million?
Unearned revenue is going to be taxes, advanced collections. There's a footnote on that.
I didn't see that. I'll look for it.
So that's,
Okay. Here's one, and I don't know that I didn't catch this in prior years or whatever, but I see the compensated absences are split between current and non-current liability. How do you do that?
an estimate. So we're estimating what we think people will use in the next year, because it's a 1 year. So it's actually just 25%. It's just something that, from experience of doing this, that's just a ballpark number. It's not calculated, clinically, like, but if we know
Okay.
everyone gets 3 weeks vacation, everyone takes that, they use X amount of sick time, it's just kind of a,
Right, but if you have a massive, let's say, retirements with people with unpaid or they banked vacation time or PTO time, that number could get blown out, right?
right, if we were aware of that, then we would adjust current. If we knew your payouts had to be X, because,
Right.
8 department heads retired and they all had a lot large, then we would adjust the current portion, but,
Right, so the 798 in the short term is purely an estimate of, based on historical rates, what you think would be paid out in the current year, within 1 year.
right, a lot of that's, again, budgeted. It's your normal
Right.
vacation and sick time people would get paid for.
But we have $4 million worth of earned comp time that hasn't been paid out.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, page 43 is the unearned, tell you what's in unearned and deferred.
Yeah, I'll take a look at that. Thanks. The, page 30. This is a question for Mr. Hiller and Mr. Tetra. So we put in place the OPEB trust fund a couple of years ago at this point, right? 2-3 years ago that was established and started to be funded? It was established 1 year?
End of fiscal 9.
Yeah. So now we've got about $7.3 million in that fund. And I see on page 30 that the proceeds of that fund are started to be invested. And the question jumped out at me of who's managing that investment of those funds?
That fund is managed by Smith Affiliated Capital, who has been a long, town has had a long relationship with them, with the pension fund, and they are the sole manager of that fund. Those funds are under the control of the Joint Investment Board, and I've had conversations with our advisor on that. We do have they are totally at this point in fixed income investments, corporate
I
bonds.
saw that.
I'm sorry?
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah. And we do have the right under state statute to take those into, a portion, a percentage, up to 60% into equity investments.
But this is being managed by the Joint Pension Investment Board.
Well, on paper, yes. In reality, they have not discussed it at this time. It is on their agenda.
So, under what guidelines is the firm that is managing these funds actually investing these funds?
They have, there were guidelines that were adopted, and they have, the firm has those guidelines.
Who adopted the guidelines?
The pension boards some time ago, at the time they were established, they were adopted.
So the pension board discuss the actual,
as to what they can do with it. As I say, the other thing is what I would call the diversification of these funds as they grow.
yeah. Can we put this on our quarterly review as to what's going on with these funds and how they're being managed and if they're being actively managed and
It is an
what
active,
type of
it is an
reporting?
active management, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that, and does the trust documents give that authority, I mean, to the Joint Pension Board to manage those funds as well?
Mr. Chair, I believe you'll find, and certainly we can provide copies for the board, is that when the OPEB trust funds were set up,
Yeah,
the management groups for that, the boards, if you will, for both funds, were set up to mirror the pension management structure.
that's all I want to confirm, yeah.
Right. And I believe we can get you copies of the ordinance to show at least that part of it, that we still need to address the rest of your question, but at least that
Yeah.
part we
No,
can
that-
document pretty quickly.
That'd be great. It just came to me when I was reading it, and I want to make sure.
Yeah, the statutes are a little bit different for pension and OPEB as
Yeah.
far as percentage of equities, so they can't be a perfect.
Can't go into a-
mirror.
Can't be, right, the decisions might not be the same. I want to make sure we've got the management structure in place, we've got the policy in place, and someone is actually looking at it.
Right.
That, you know.
Yep.
Okay. House split. Page 38, minimum fund balance policy. I'm going to take issue with this, and I think I did last year, too. Can someone show me the document that says that we adopted a minimum fund balance policy for the general fund of 5%?
I forwarded it to Mr. Senafani's office. I will,
When was that adopted?
I don't have the exact date, but there is a document that because Mr. Senafani asked for it this year, and I forwarded it to him.
Do you remember adopting that? I just don't ever remember it coming before us for a vote. And again, this goes back to that whole 5%, and it goes back
Yeah.
to, you're probably asking for the document, because I questioned this comment last year.
Well, this is a required disclosure. If you have one, I have to put it in here. So we asked, do you have one? And the document we're provided, this is the policy. So
Yeah,
this
I'd just
is-
like to know that it was voted on by this board. I mean, you might have a policy, but I don't know that it was voted on by the Board of Finance, and I just want to confirm whether it was or wasn't.
Okay,
It could have been, but,
great.
okay. Page 40. I think we ask this every year. Can we clean up some of the capital project authorizations? Can we close out some of these?
We did.
Okay. Can we get a list of what's now open? And the one thing that's not on here, that I'm assuming may be buried in the capital projects, is the Merritt Bridge that we're going to talk about later today?
That's in the capital projects, yes. Because that was in the non-recurring allocation previously.
Yeah, but there's two here. There's capital projects and then there's non-recurring. So it doesn't really, so I don't know why they're, we basically have 30-some-odd thousand that are buried in two numbers. Now, I understand the non-recurring, I don't understand the capital projects, and obviously, the Merritt Bridge would stick out like a sore thumb because it would be what was authorized and then what was not spent. So that's kind of buried in here. So can we get an updated list of what's closed out, not closed out? And can we see a breakout of the capital projects so I think we can determine where we are? Thanks. Page 42. I was going to, Mr. Senafani, I was going to comment on the fact that the investment committee was talking about an investment policy. So I made the note of your disclosure here.
Okay, good.
Paul, I had a question on, and we don't need to do this now, but can we see what the write-offs are on the
accounts, I've noticed you got the allowance for doubtful accounts here is, $472,000. I'd be interested to see what our level of write-offs are.
What page are you on, Tim?
I'm sorry.
What page?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I flipped ahead. Page 43. Page 52. And guys, my apologies for taking so much time. I just want to, page 52, the classes of employees covered. I thought it would be interesting. We talk a lot about long-term liabilities and the growth in long-term liabilities and having to fund it more each time. If you look at the chart on page 52, you have the retiree benefits currently receiving benefits versus the active plan members. It would be interesting to see what those trend lines are over time of the number of people receiving benefits versus the number of actives paying into the benefit pools, and see over a period of years how that's growing or not growing. Yeah. I just think it'd be an interesting data point to have as you evaluate kind of our issues in that area, because it might tell you, might be an indicator of where things are going in the future. That's why I looked at it. Page 54, I noted that you're referring to July 1st, 2010 documents for the status, not 2011. Is that just because 2011 was not available?
Well, the contribution requirement for fiscal 11 is based upon a July 1, 10 report.
Right.
This is consistent with all prior years and consistent with all.
Yeah, I thought so. It was just a little confusing because I'm not sure it was.
It always is, but this is basically
It's the basis for which the contribution was done for
yeah,
2011.
and it's basically, this is the GASB 25, 27.
Maybe we could just do a disclosure. It's just, I think we should say why.
Yeah, it is confusing. It confuses everybody, to be honest, because
Yeah.
it looks like
Every-
the wrong year.
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
your initial reaction is you put the wrong year in here unless you disclose the fact that we're putting it in here because it relates to how the calculation was
I
done.
assure you that every municipal audit in the state will have the same date.
I'm not worried about them. I'm worried about us. Page 58. Question here. This gets into OPEB, and I think these footnotes are getting longer and longer as the years go by, right? Because we've got the
GASB's
trust fund and GASB's doing the disclosure requirements and all that, right?
batting stuff, yes.
All right. I was a little confused, so bear with me. It's labeled other post-employee benefit plans, right? But are the numbers just retirees, or do the numbers include the actives and the retirees in terms of the dollars? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, this is supposed to be just to fund retirees. Now, is there a part of the contribution, that assuming some active people will retire eventually? Yeah, that's figured into that, but this is just for retiree. Your internal service fund is where all your active is accounted for. The active employees are paid. The claims are paid out of the internal service. Retiree claims are paid conceptually out of the trust.
So this excludes payments out of the trust, or payments out of the OPEB, or payments out of the fund, whatever you want to call it, related to active employees.
Yes, yeah, it doesn't. Active employees are accumulating potential benefits.
I understand that, that's actuarially
Yeah.
determined. But this excludes them
That-
taking money out for current year.
That is correct.
Okay. So, page 58, when I look at the numbers, here was my question. And forgive this is a stupid question. So you have, for the town side and the fire side, I get it. Though I'm not 100% sure I understand why the numbers are significantly different than the numbers on page 52.
okay? Because the numbers appear to be significantly different in terms of number of employees. Right? So I know one's talking about pension, and one's talking about OPEB, but I was surprised to see the differential. Right, for the town, for pension, you have almost 1,200. And for the town, for OPEB, you have 533. And then there's less of a difference on the police and fire, so I was just a little,
Primary difference there, that on page 52,
yep,
that number, get back to it. That number includes a significant number of Board of Education employees. That the delta there is primarily going to be the paraprofessionals, the secretaries, the custodians, et cetera, who are not within the OPEB trust but are in the pension plan.
maybe you need to break that out, that classification, so that it's not, instead of 2 columns on page 52, maybe 3 columns.
Whereas, as you see a more consistent number with the police and fire.
Yeah, no, you do. You're still 50 off, but,
And on page 58, the Board of Education employees that are listed there are not exclusively, but predominantly the certified personnel who are in the state pension plan.
and here was my question. Why are they included for OPEB here for medical benefits? Aren't they on the state level there as well, once they
Required by state
retire?
statute.
That they're,
It's required by state statute that we offer the plans to them. They don't have to take it, but they potentially,
because they take the state plan?
well, a significant number do. For example, you see there's 251 who are listed here who are, and that gets into the whole question of the implicit rate subsidy. And
But are the 251 who do take it, are they just the ones that aren't offered the state plan because on page 52 they would be considered town employees? Do you know what I'm saying? They're non-certified.
no, these are not exclusively, but predominantly. There are a few people in the Board of Education. We can get back to you as far as what that split is, but it's a handful who are not certified. And those were on separate arrangements.
Then your other comment doesn't hold water.
What the state statutes say is the last place a teacher worked as a teacher, they can go back to that town and get in the group insurance plan, even if they're doing something totally different. So they could be 30 years old, and they can get into the group plan. So they may not retire for another 30.
Right.
So until they actually start collecting from the state, the town has to allow them into the group plan. They can make them pay whatever number you request. Usually it's the blended rate, which active pay, which then creates this implicit rate subsidy and creates that liability that's not a real liability.
Right.
So that's why I said it kind of goes away over time, because as they just go through the system, the liability flips the other way. So it's just the statute that allows anyone, whenever they worked, and until they retire in the state system, you're counting them. So that's what the problem is.
I think I understand that, but.
You have 2 primary categories at the Board of Education. You have those certified teachers and administrators
Yep,
who are in the state pension plan.
yep.
That group is the one that Mr. Sanafani refers to as this group in which they have the option upon retirement of taking insurance through us. We're not contributing to it, and it's basically a pay-as-you-go plan. The other group are those non-certified employees, the paraprofessional secretaries, custodians are the primary, and several other administrative employees in this building,
Yep.
as an example, who are members of the town employee's pension plan.
Right.
And contribute to that.
Right.
And are eligible for benefits just as a town employee is. And so that's the primary distinction.
Right. No, I get it. I just don't understand. I still, and we can take this offline, we don't need to take time here, but I still am having trouble reconciling then with that explanation, the discrepancy in the number on page 52 for town employees versus Board of Education on page 58.
We get these right from the actuary report, so there may be something more detailed in there that,
Yeah, we found before that we've had errors in the actuarial report, I think,
okay.
going back a number of years in terms of the number. I'm not casting aspersions, I'm
Right.
just saying,
Right, but that's the source of this, so.
Right.
So we may be summarizing, there may be a little bit more detail in the report that may answer what you're asking.
okay, that'd be great. So, and the other thing that confused me as to whether this was purely retirement, retired employees or also active employees, was the chart on 59, which talked about the funded status and then went into the whole status of covered payroll, right? And when I was looking at that, I was like, okay, if you're talking about covered payroll, are you talking about new employees? Or, I mean, are you talking about current employees as opposed to just retirees? You don't understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that goes back to, there's some current employees are projected.
Right,
to
they're gonna have some
retire, so-
benefits,
So
right.
that's why it's getting factored in this, because your total liability includes, in theory, everything.
Okay, so explain to me on page 61, the one number that confused me there was contributions made on the Board of Education side, right?
Yep.
Where we're saying we went from at one point contributing 91% to now down in the 30s and 40s. And again, this was a source of a little bit of confusion for me when I was reading the statement. Because I was thinking this went to the whole situation last year where they had stopped putting in as much as they were putting in prior years for the medical fund. Is that what this represents? Because I thought that was more on the active side than the retiree side, and again, I was going apples to oranges here. I don't know, was anybody else confused reading this? Do you understand?
Yeah, I mean, conceptually, the Board of Ed number is the pay-as-you-go number. So in theory, that's what they paid during the year for retiree medical, because this is not a funded plan. So
Okay, but how did we go from 91% to 41%? That's the one that flipped me out a little bit. I understand what you're saying, but we went from 91% to 41%.
Yeah, something for 2009, you're right, doesn't look, it's twice plus,
Doesn't pass the smell test.
Tom?
yes.
Yeah.
Question for you. If it's not a funded plan, if it's a pay-as-you-go plan, what is the percentage of?
Exactly.
That's the question. 91% of what, or 41% of what?
Right.
Well, they get credit for what they paid. The actuary's saying you should have put into a trust, you just chose not to, 1,679,000. But you paid out 689, so that difference.
Is that because they had better experience than would have been predicted?
Right. I was trying to figure out whether that
Yeah.
whole adjustment
Right.
was flowing through
I
here.
mean, that would be a big, happy miss, so to speak,
Yeah,
right? That'd be a good miss, but that
Or,
seems, it
or
seems
this
too
was just
big.
saying you're underfunding it, so you're using your reserve.
But how could you be underfunding?
Well, you're not funding
Yeah.
future costs, you're just, again, pay as you go. So the difference is they
Okay,
expect
so-
you to be funding it, so there's funding for the prior service costs.
But this would imply at one point you were funding future costs, and you're saying now, we're not funding future costs. Do you see what I'm saying?
If I look at the 1.5 number as a contribution, that does look like that might be incorrect, because now you're consistent at 611, 689, kind of a normal trend.
Right.
So the 1.530, we can go back and look at the actuary report, again, that's where that's coming, and see if that's not quite right. That,
I think the only, and I do know this, and Mr. Carey, who's our new representative from the Board of Ed, may check on this also. they had a dramatic decline in numbers of people who were in the plans a couple of years ago. And I think that that contribution number, which is the pay-as-you-go portion, that's what people are actually paying into it. So what's happened is that frankly, a lot fewer people are in it than were 2 years ago, or at inception, or when we started to report under GASB 45. And I think that's what may be, but we can check on that number and get back to you as to what the,
It'd be great
what
to
the
be-
census was.
Yeah, well, all the other ones, and again, this is a happy thing, right? If you look at the town and the police and fire, we're improving every year.
Yep.
So the areas where we focus attention on, whether it be the general fund or the internal service fund, each year, step by step, we're taking that stair step that I've referred to, and we're improving.
Yeah.
This area looks like a dramatic downfall, and that might be totally unfair, but that's what's, without any explanation, that's what this tells me.
Right, no, I would agree, it doesn't look right, although you improve this year over last year, it's still half of what it was in
Right.
2009, so.
Right. Okay, that's about as far as I got on that report. Can we go to this one real quick? The required communications. Can we go to I want to go to the recommendations that you highlighted earlier.
Okay. Page 22.
Yeah, page 22. Thank you. So the special revenue funds, we talked about that earlier, and we've asked the audit committee to look at that with you. The investment classifications, what are we doing on that one?
I'm going to have a conversation. Basically, there are, the pension board uses two fixed income managers. The OPEB trust uses a third. People's Bank uses a different pricing service than any of the other three, I believe. I'm not certain on that. And I think Mr. Centofanti can correct me, and I think what the problem is the pricing and the ratings that we're getting. We're required, they're required to submit to us the ratings, and there's a lack of consistency between those firms.
So how do you decide who to use? I heard you say you used you used the trustee, right?
It's more of if we call something a certain kind of fixed income.
Yeah.
Peoples may classify it differently, so it's more amounts. I don't think we use I don't think Peoples in some cases gives us the ratings, so we're using the investment managers for the ratings and duration, not part of the footnote. But then when I try to tie in, if it said it had 42 million in corporate bonds, that's not exactly what Peoples says.
So in total, you tie, but the classifications between the two reporting
It's-
entities.
Right, just, so it's getting, if People's is more just getting information, it's just getting it to be the same. So when I get the trustee, the investment manager report, I can see that it goes right to the trust report. So that's what the comment's more getting at.
But it's a repeat comment from prior years.
Right.
Yes.
Did we have any conversations with them?
We've had some. One of the investment managers has had some change in personnel, and it's one to be readdressed.
Okay. I was surprised, there was nothing in the recommendations to management regarding items seen in the train station. I think in your presentation, you had said those were all addressed in the train station.
Since I already provided them to you, I didn't repeat them as part of this document.
Have you noted any improvements in that area? In other words, are we tracking those recommendations as a management team and saying what have been implemented from those recommendations and what haven't?
I haven't tracked them since
Right.
they were provided.
Right.
So that's something we would follow up, we'll say, mostly next year, because they weren't provided until after this year end. So it'd be something we would look at.
Right.
As
That
far
might
as
be
a
something we just
follow-up.
want to make sure we don't lose sight of those. I'd almost like to have them in one spot, so that you could go down point by point and say, what are we doing about these items? So, that was all. Thank you very much. Does anybody else have any questions, any follow-ups, any other comments on the financial reports? And my apologies for the time I took. I will go to the public on this. Mr. Walsh, I think you had your hand up, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a couple questions and, I guess, comments. The first is on page 31 of the Blue Book,
A light blue book.
the light blue book.
Carolyn.
Under the investment income, the recoveries, which say Madoff next to them, I presume are Madoff recoveries from the fund. Is this the first year that's been reported on?
No.
Second year.
And what's the cumulative amounts recovered to date, not to date, through June 30th of 2011? Is there anything, I didn't see any schedule in here showing a year-to-year comparison.
On that basis, 4,000,001.
4,000,001 to that point in time? Okay.
That's a cumulative through June 30th.
Of 2011, okay. On page 38, getting back to something Chairman Flynn was discussing, your minimum fund balance policy with the discussions that have happened this evening where we've now learned that we should be shooting for a target that was pretty much double what most of us had presumed the target was supposed to be. It would seem that your board at some point in time should talk about, number one, defining whether there is a provision that you have approved, and number two, maybe refining that to present-day numbers that we're now hearing for the first time.
I personally agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard some of the discussion, same numbers you've heard over the years at various, when I was on the RTM. I've heard Mr. Tetro's predecessor talk about why 4% wasn't that big of a deal, that we were right around the 5%. But now we're hearing that that's the bottom target. So we're aiming at a bottom number.
Yeah.
We're aiming to the bottom. And as much work as previous boards of selectmen, and especially this board has done, and the hard work and the tough decisions and cutting expenses to try to get over the 5% and now getting to 5.18%, to hear that we're really supposed to possibly be double that is concerning. I think further discussions need to be held about how we got to that number. And I guess you're right. I guess during the budget season, I think we're all going to have to talk about how we get to raising that and over what period of time, and to start setting some type of guidelines, kind of like we said at OPEB. I don't think it's correct for the taxpayer to have to absorb that overnight, but maybe some long-term plan on how we're going to get that balance up to at least a more respectable level.
Agree.
My last is more of, I guess, a question on page 40 of the light blue book, and it deals with that footnote. And Paul, I don't know whether this is more directed to you or Mr. Centofanti, but it still raises the question that in regards to the Metro Center project, we have still not appropriated approximately $22,365,000 ever. None of the boards. And in light of, Mr. Centofanti's investigation, our independent counsel's investigation, and finding that we didn't follow charter provisions, I still, is there a reason why we're not going to bring this back at least to correct the records for this town and appropriate the correct amount once and for all, to finally appropriate the correct amount that should be appropriated for this project so that we don't have to keep having footnotes? Because right now it still says we're appropriating the $10 million plus now the $7 million that we appropriated in August, approximately. I think that was in August.
I don't know who wants to answer that, Mr. Tetro or Mr. Staffstrom, or
And I wouldn't mind hearing bond counsel's legal opinion about whether we do need to appropriate that finally. Sure, one chance.
That was just the conversation and just the discussion we had a couple months earlier, sitting with Mr. Centrofani to see what his deadlines were in terms of getting that through. But specifically, regardless of what we do at this point, there will be a footnote in here in that the annual report referencing that originally wasn't approved in the process, and it'll go back and do this. So we can't hide it, we can't make it go away. That's in fact what happened. The question then becomes, what's the difference between having a footnote that says, as this does, it wasn't approved, or B, a footnote that says, well, it shows it's approved, but it really wasn't approved. And that was all done after the fact. The difference between this financial report and possibly the typical financial report we're used to in the private sector is there's a very limited audience for this. 3 people, aside from this board, of course, but 3 organizations, S&P, Fitch, and Moody's. They're both educated, and because when we present this as part of our bond offerings, we can step through what happened with that, as we did this summer, and as we did again this fall. And in discussions with Mr. Centrofani, with Mr. Staffstrom, bond counsel, and looking at how it would be presented either way, and given the timing we were going through in the fall in terms of what to get to, and the cutoffs that Mr. Centrofani had for our financial statements, we felt that it wasn't necessary at that point to go back and do that. But certainly if that was the desire of this board, we could certainly look at that.
Thank you, Mr. Tetra. Mr. Walsh, anything else?
I think at some point we should go back, and I requested this board go back and do that. There's been enough procedures not followed in regards to the Metro Center. I think it's time to correct the record to finally to appropriate those funds that have already been spent. I think it's just, we should do things the right way, not the wrong way. And we shouldn't set any type of precedent going forward that you don't have to appropriate $23 million. You know, so that nobody looks back and says we can do this. Oh, we did it on the Metro Center. Thanks.
Thanks. Any other comments, questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you sitting through the other presentations, and I appreciate your work. We look forward to seeing you again. All right. Item number 5, to hear, consider, and act upon a resolution authorizing the issuance of bonds in principal amount of $225,000 to finance the remaining unpaid costs incurred in connection with the construction of Harbor Road Bridge, and authorizing the first selectman to sign the agreement entitled Second Supplemental Agreement between the State of Connecticut and Town of Fairfield for the construction, inspection, and maintenance required in conjunction with the replacement of the Harbor Road Bridge over the Mill River, utilizing federal funds from the Highway Bridge Program and a project grant from the state's local bridge program. Welcome, Mr. White.
Thank you. Good evening. The new Harbor Road Bridge over the Mill River in Southport was completed in 2006. We just recently received the second and final supplemental funding agreement that will allow us to close out the project and receive the remaining state and federal funding, which equals $1,085,000. The significant delay in closing out this project was due to a long negotiation with the contractor over a very costly, complicated, and unavoidable change order. That was eventually reduced from $420,000 to $160,000. And also, the time required in preparing the necessary paperwork to meet DOT's requirement to prepare this final supplemental funding agreement. The final cost of the project, $3,680,152, is $319,798 less than the town's appropriation of $3,900,000. But the town's appropriation was based on the expectation that the cost would be totally reimbursed by federal and state funds. There are 225 $100,000 of ineligible, grant ineligible cost that must be paid by the town, and that's the reason for this request. The final state and federal funding for this project will equal 93% versus the 100% originally anticipated. The $225,000 of ineligible costs consist of the following. There was $8,000 required for winterizing the bridge and $7,000 required for temporary curbing and other safety features. And let me back up for a second. If you're familiar with the bridge, it's essentially an island in the middle where there's a office building. And there are really two bridges that serve that island, the west side and the east side. And the commitment to the owner of the building there, the office building there, by the town was always that he would have unimpeded access to his business. So what happened was the contractor finished the west side of the bridge. The timing was such unavoidable that he was finished that in the wintertime. And he was starting to move to the east side and take that out of service. But to allow, again, the safe access to the office building, we needed to take some temporary measures to make it safe. Put the paving down just before the plant's closed and put some markings down, some temporary barriers, curbing, things like that. The major part of the grant ineligible costs are engineering-related costs, and they're approximately $205,800. And there's two components to those. They're ineligible due to state and federal criteria with respect to the grant. The first is the state and federal criteria for not paying costs incurred 120 days after the completion date. The completion date for the bridge in terms of when it was open was like August 2006. So theoretically, based on their agreement, they were not required to pay an engineering cost after that date, even though obviously we were incurring engineering costs to negotiate and deal with that large change order and at least a couple of years of getting the paperwork ready for this final funding agreement. The second component is a criteria that the state has that they don't participate in costs that exceed 15% of the construction cost. Let me back up for a second. That first criteria that I mentioned resulted in $165,200 of ineligible cost, engineering costs. The second one that relates to that 15% cap equated to $40,000. So the total ineligible engineering cost turned out to be $205,800. Add that to the $15,000, I'm at around $220,000. I rounded that up to $225,000 for this request. So basically, we're requesting that those $225,000 of non-grant cost, non-grant eligible cost, so that we can close out the project, make the final payment to the contractor and the engineer, and have the selectmen execute the supplemental funding agreement, which allows the federal and state money to flow to the town. Again, $1,083,770. I know it's been a long time. This is kind of complicated, so I'll answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. White. Do we have any questions from board members? Mr. Bolito, followed by Mr. DeWitt. Anybody else?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, the change order, can you describe, in some detail what exactly transpired and you had a discrepancy that once was saying 420,000, and then he got it down to 160, which is a pretty significant number. What was that all about?
The west side bridge, when it was removed, the contractor needed to replace everything, including the abutments. And the plans, based on borings that were done prior to putting together the design, indicated that he would hit solid bedrock at about -6 elevation, or approximately 9 feet down from the surface of the water. It turned out, as he started to excavate, that those borings were hitting false rock. It was shale, it wasn't bedrock. So he ended going down another 3 meters, 2 to 3 meters plus, 6 to 9 feet in different areas. That's pretty significant when you're already underwater. And he had to increase the, well, he had to drive his sheeting down further. And if you can picture it, sheeting ideally would be driven in mud, and then it's pretty effective. But here he's trying to drive it down into rock that's all different elevations, so it's not meeting the surface very efficiently. He has to sandbag it a lot. He has to reinforce it because now he's at a deeper depth, and there's a lot more pressure on that sheathing, which forms the safe area for him to work inside. The cofferdam, with that sheeting protection actually collapsed. And part of his claims was that he felt that was a valid claim to pass on the cost of rebuilding more substantial sheathing. With our engineer's help, we were able to argue that he didn't take the necessary precautions as he was going down further to reinforce his sheathing correctly, and that basically the catastrophic failure of his sheeting was on his dime.
So basically, we had a situation where there were unforeseen site conditions that the contractor faced. The contractor took steps to navigate that.
Right.
He then says, well, I'm going to pass that cost on to you because the first attempt failed. Now we got to do this extra work. And what the town's position was that you should have been doing it differently in the first place.
Right.
So that's where you came to the $160,000 figure. Okay, got that. The other thing is, how much of the amount that you're seeking here tonight is because of that versus because of certain things that are not covered by the state and the federal grant, specifically the things you mentioned, winterizing the bridge, the temporary precast curb, and the ineligible engineering costs?
Well,
I'm just trying to get at what's driving the overage.
Right. Well, when the change order was reduced to from 420 to 160,000, that became a completely eligible cost.
Okay.
So that was reimbursed.
All right, so that's just by way of background.
Yes.
Okay, I got it.
And the more related to the delay, or
Right.
the reason for the
Sure.
delay. The ineligible costs are, again, those the 15,000 related to making the West Side Bridge completely accessible and safe for the office building and their tenants, and the 205,000 of ineligible engineering costs, which became that because of a couple of state and federal criteria.
Okay. So the winterizing the bridge and the temporary precast curb, those can be attributed directly to making, creating accessibility for the office building and the tenants, correct?
Right. And that was our agreement with the tenant.
Okay,
And the
understood
state
that.
said that that was our agreement. They really weren't obliged to participate in that.
Sure, okay, I get that. Now, as far as the ineligible engineering costs, was that driven by the delays caused by that boring issue that the contractor came across?
Yes, yes. Because the first piece, obviously, $165,000 of ineligible costs were made ineligible because those books weren't closed out before 120 days or 4 months after the bridge was open for business. But we were negotiating with the contractor, way beyond that. So
Right.
it wasn't practical for us to do it within the 120 days. But that 120-day criteria is in the original funding agreement. And the state, and I don't think they can really bend on that.
So you went past 120 days because of the delays incurred by the contractor. Any thought of going after the contractor to recover money caused by the delays? Understanding that you negotiated down the change order, but that
No, I
being
understand.
said, still a significant amount of dollars here that we're being asked to appropriate due to essentially a delay caused by the contractor's, if not negligence, failure to act.
No, that's a good point. But we honestly felt that we were working, with full disclosure and agreement with the state that they would participate in those costs.
Did they change the criteria, or was it just a matter of the criteria that you anticipated meeting were not met because of the delays?
No, the criteria are always in the original document.
Okay.
Then maybe we made the mistake of thinking that because they were aware of it, and we were constantly in discussions with them, that, they were aware that this is going on beyond the
Saying they, you mean
120.
the state?
The state,
Okay.
yes. That they would participate in those costs.
Okay, Mr. DeWitt, I know you're patiently waiting. Can I just ask a question on Mr. Bolitos? I just want to tell you what I'm hearing. Tell me if it makes sense. So there were unforeseen circumstances that resulted in a bill coming from the contractor of somewhere to the tune of $450,000. You guys, in trying to do what was best, tried to negotiate down the bill that was $450,000 to a more reasonable number. In taking on those negotiations, you went past the 120 days allotted for you to submit expenses for reimbursement by the state. Is that all
Correct.
fair?
Yes. I just want to add that even with that negotiations with the contractor, it still would have been extremely tight to get the paperwork together in that 120 days. That 120
Why?
days no longer appears in their agreements.
Right. Why would it have been extremely tight?
The other aspect of the soap opera was that there was the inspector for the project. And let me just back up a second. In the old days being about 15 years ago, inspectors on bridge projects were kind of like clerk of the works, where they just simply kept track of how many trucks came in, how many laborers are on the job, and things like that. The responsibilities for that position are much more significant today because they are the ones that are preparing the paperwork to satisfy the grant agreements and close out these projects. Having said that, the person that was on the job was very qualified, et cetera, but as soon as the bridge was completed, he had another job. He switched companies and went with another job, which made it very difficult to close out the books because it takes participation of the on-site inspector.
Who was he working for?
He's working for the engineer.
And who was paying the engineer?
We were.
So he wasn't working for the state, and this wasn't a state inspector. This was the same engineer who was overseeing the project, lost his inspector, and because the engineer who was overseeing the project lost his inspector,
Right.
and because you had this disagreement with the contractor over who bore the cost, we missed the 120 days.
I'm saying that that was a contributing factor.
Right. I think that's what I just said. I
Yeah.
didn't say it was.
Right.
But in theory, we would have been better off as a town in passing along the $450,000 worth of expense to the state within the 120 days
and letting them pay for the whole thing versus doing the right thing, which was getting the price down as much as possible.
No, I understand, you're right, that's correct.
Right. So because we did the right thing, you did the right thing in terms of the 160, because the engineer lost his inspector, the taxpayers directly have to take $160,000.
That's correct, yeah.
And the state couldn't see that they were incenting bad behavior?
No, they hung completely back on that one sentence in the original supplemental agreement saying that the project was supposed to be closed out within the 120 days. With due respect to them, that agreement is a state-federal agreement. They would have to go back and try to say that, renegotiate, I guess, with the feds too.
Right, and then,
but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, and then with the engineering firm, you're saying there was a particular inspector
Yes.
that was employed by the engineering firm,
Yes.
and he quit. And then the engineering firm had a problem closing out the bridge.
Yeah, right. They had problem closing out the paperwork because they needed to bring him back, whenever he was available on part-time, whatever, to, finish and decipher the paperwork, et cetera. So that did cause delays.
And to make up for the fact that they caused you delays, that cost you money, what did the engineering firm to make good on the fact? Because the fact that he has a personnel issue, I don't care.
The only thing I can say is that what we've learned, and help me out here, but what we learned going forward was that we require on these next job merit street, the engineering firm guarantee as part of their agreement that the inspector stay for the full duration of the project, which includes closeout of the paperwork. I don't know.
But that's not assumed when you contract with an engineer, it's not assumed that they can actually deliver that. In other words, why is that? If I hire a company to do a job for me and they lose their employee, I don't care. I mean, it's their problem. That's why I hired them.
Right.
Why am I held financially? And by the way, I understand the point that there was ongoing negotiations, and this has been how many years? 5 years? But I don't understand why that's my concern if the engineering firm lost their guy. That's what we're paying them for. No? You know what I mean?
What could we have done?
Well, how did the engineering firm make good on the fact that they cost you a bunch of money by missing deadlines? Or are you saying that that wasn't the primary cost?
No, their position is similar to what you're saying, that they don't have any control over if an employee leaves. I mean,
They don't have any, so they're basically saying, hey, our employee left, sorry, you got shafted
no,
on
they
this
certainly
one."
did their best they could to bring someone in to review the books and close things out. I'm just saying that there is a delay associated with someone picking up a project that they weren't involved with from day one, having to review the books, understand them, et cetera, and go forward.
And all I'm saying is, did we go back to them and say, hey, you missed this deadline, you cost us money. Are you going to cut your fee to help make up for the fact that you cost us money here? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, I know what you're saying. That conversation was made without any,
Were they already fully paid at that point in time?
no.
Are they fully paid as of today?
No, we owe them $34,800.
And how much of the delay were they responsible for by not having their employee who?
I can't, it'd be hard to prove, but I would just be making a guess on it. I could. I mean, and we put that pressure on them saying that. But it is what it is.
Mr. Polito, thank you, Mr.
Well,
White.
just
I'm not-
back up a second.
Yeah.
Not to make this up.
Please, no, feel free.
I feel like I'm going to get on the bicycle and start pedaling backwards. Without, with due respect, and not throwing the engineer under the bus, but still telling you that there was a lot to this thing, is that when
It
we,
was very complicated,
yeah,
yeah.
and when we first started this project, way back when, in 2003, we really chased this grant hard. It was one of the first ones to get 100% funding on it. So I'll take credit for that and in my engineering department doing that. We went through a long RFP process to select an engineer for this bridge because we knew it was going to be a son of a gun with historic problems, being in a historic area, the conservation issues because it's very sensitive estuary and all the things like that. So we carefully selected a firm that we felt could do the job, and we proceeded with them, and things were moving very smoothly. That firm was bought out by another company, which is unfortunately the recent trend in local engineering firms. I, at that time, made the request to the state to go back to an RFP process or go back to the original engineer. They strongly advised against that because of the timeline and upsetting the funding agreement. So I ended up with, quite honestly, an engineering firm that I wasn't as fully comfortable with because of that.
Yeah.
Make requests. I have documentation of emails asking them to participate in different aspects of it, but I never felt cooperation from them.
I guess you're just building more of my case as to why should we pay them the complete $34,000 that the road if they lost a guy and it caused undue delay to getting paperwork filed and getting reimbursement or getting the opportunity for reimbursement. That's what.
Just to finish up, going back to a point I made earlier, what plan does the town attorney have to investigate this and bring a cause of action against certainly the contractor and perhaps the engineer? Do we have an answer to that question?
I don't.
Anyone? It sounds to me like there's at least something actionable here, and this is costing the taxpayers additional money. And from what I'm hearing factually here tonight, this was caused by delays in the project due to the contractor's negligence or, not doing things properly. Mr. Tetra?
I think we'll take a look and explore that fully. I think based on the discussions we had previously, it didn't appear to be negligence on that part, but I think your point's well taken, and we'll make sure we explore that.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Mr. DeWitt, I'm sorry, you've been patient.
I'm going to take Mr. White off the hot seat for a minute, because I want to talk about process. So in our budget book that we're currently executing right now, there was a capital improvement project for this bridge for $240,000. And I quote, "Construction of the new bridge was completed in 2007. The state legislature, in an effort to cut costs, eliminated payments under the local bridge program. As a result, the town lost its share of 20%, equivalent to $240,000. That was not approved.
Right. That's
the same thing you're talking about.
No. That's a fourth soap opera. During
That's
this-
a what?
A fourth soap opera.
A fourth.
2 years ago. Well,
I've
we
been
were
reading a lot of those have gotten canceled recently.
Yeah, sounds like this one's going to get one, too.
2 years ago, the state, in an effort to bring its budget in line, eliminated the local bridge program, which provides for 20% share on these type of projects.
Right.
We were stunned that they included projects like this that were already in the pipeline. In other words, they had been completed, and we were just simply trying to get the state DOT to finalize the paperwork, to get our money.
Right.
But they did, and that was going to cost us about $248,000 at that time. And we made a lot of requests to our local legislators who got involved in it and eventually made us whole on that aspect of that. When I was making that request, I had no assurance that we were going to be made whole by the state legislators. So in terms of the state eliminating the local bridge program,
Right.
and potentially costing us $248, they came up with the funding and put that in this second.
Okay, so that went away.
That went away.
Great. Per our book we just got tonight, under capital appropriations projects, it says that 3.9 million for the Harbor Road Bridge was authorized, of which we've only spent 3.314 million, and that we have a balance. So if we've already appropriated that money, why aren't we using that money?
Again, just to back up.
Could I touch on that? And maybe bond counsel wants to comment further too. There were 4 separate appropriations on this bridge, dating originally, perhaps Mr. Kiley or Mrs. Leclerc may remember, because they were here at the beginning. There were 4 separate appropriations, commencing in 2002, the most recent one being in 2006, which total up to the $3.9 million. When we reviewed the records with the town clerk's office and the work of the bond council, all of those resolutions have language 100% funded by state and federal funds.
Right?
So the good news is, and goodness, is we have the appropriation.
So we've been
The bad-
totally reimbursed
I'm
for
sorry?
this. We've been totally reimbursed for this.
No, we have not been totally reimbursed. We've been, we have a shortfall because of what Mr. White has indicated. We have
So
an
the-
obligation to it. The net we have spent, based on the audit, $3,314,000.
Right?
There have been other expenses since that time. There is a total project cost of $3,580,000. The basic problem we have is primarily that the 4 prior resolutions, which are, other than amount and other than date passed, are virtually identical. They all contemplate 100% reimbursement. We're not going to get 100% reimbursement. And we know that, and I think that that window from the state is closed. And
So even though we got the 240, then Mr.
240
White
we
said
did get. That was
we did
primarily
get
through the
that.
efforts of Senator McKinney and former State Representative Drew, that we got those funds.
Okay. So, and then I'm going to follow. So in this book, why does it not say that the cumulative expenditures for this capital appropriation project is not 3.5 something, instead of 3.314? Because that's what you just said it was, right?
Well, 3.314 was what is our cash out.
This is cumulative
auditors-
expenditures. And you just said we cumulatively spent 3.5 some number.
That's what we're that's the final project cost, which is on the sheet which Mr.
That's
White
what,
gave.
that's what we've paid, right?
Audited sheet, because as we indicated, he indicates,
Oh, we
we
haven't paid
owe,
it yet.
we have a payable of 365,000.
There's still a balance from the original appropriation. Why
And-
can't we
and
just
there
use
will
that
be-
money? Because it said it was 100% reimbursable to the state? And because the
we're
state
not
didn't want to
going as
reimburse
far
us, we
as-
can't
we're
use
not
that
going
money?
as far as 3.9 million. I think, and if you look at the bond resolution,
We were using that money when they said they weren't paying us the 240,000.
The bond resolution to finance the remaining unpaid costs incurred in the construction. So really, we see what they've done is they've paid us, they paid us everything less the $225,000.
Have we received all the funds from the state and the feds for this yet?
Received all that I anticipate we'll receive.
All except for this
I don't have the
last one.
exact date. We received,
Well, we're not, okay, because it says here.
at some point during this calendar year, or not this calendar year, the previous, sometime during 2011, we received,
Well, on page 8 of this, or page 2.8, it says, if we do not approve this request and execute the supplemental funding agreement, the town will not receive the federal and state funds owed to date for the project. Have we received all the funds owed from the state? and the
less the 220, 225.
Well, we're never going to get
That's not but that's not the state reimbursement, that's us not getting an engineer to go do his job in time.
Well, that's,
So there's no more state money to get, right?
Okay,
That's
and
gone.
On item 2 here, Kevin points out that it says we're still owed $1,085,000.
That's correct. What we've received to date,
Who's on first?
no, what we've received to date from our document in our accounting department is $2,273,629. The total grant for this project from the second supplemental funding agreement is $3,359,400. The difference that they still owe us is $1,085,771.
And we've spent how, because so this is wrong.
Can Kevin stay on this point
Yeah,
for a
yeah,
second?
go ahead.
Just, thank you. Just on that point there, the $1,085,000 that's still owed to the town from the state and the federal governments is contingent upon execution of this bonding resolution and contingent upon paying the vendors, or does it include the payments to the vendors in those numbers?
Yes.
What do we need to do, let me say it a better way. What do we need to do to get the $1,086,000 that's owed to us?
We need to, the selectman needs to execute the second supplemental funding agreement.
Which he already has.
No, he hasn't.
No, we're being asked to approve it now.
But the 225 we're being asked for today is only to pay for the engineer. Has nothing to do with the supplemental agreement to the state.
Well, that's-
This is a cost above and beyond what the state was reimbursing us for. Right?
I'm sorry, say that again, Mr.
The 225 you're asking for tonight
Yes.
is above and beyond cost, above and beyond what the state was reimbursing us for, because it's 100%, it's 100% driven from the fact that we didn't get an engineer to do his work on time. We needed to winterize the bridge and do a temporary precast. That's the only thing we're paying for with this 225. So all the supplemental agreements are in place.
I think the key question, though, is, and this is what Kevin, I think, is asking, is what do we need to do to get the $1,086,000?
No, I'm right with you now, because
So what do we need
the
to
supplemental
do?
agreement, well, and Mr. White's answer was execute the supplemental agreement.
Let me just say this. The supplemental agreement includes the latest construction and engineering numbers in there. So the assumption is that when you execute the supplemental agreement, that you're paying, for the contractor.
Why does the state care if we pay the contractor?
Well, they're not going to give us grant money and not pay the contractor.
Right, so that's my point.
That'd be a great deal.
That's my point. So the $1,086,000 assumes we're going to pay the engineer $35K and the contractor $230,000.
Yes.
So the net difference of that, roughly $250 out of the $1 million, the net difference of $800,000 would come back into the town.
Yes.
The net difference.
Yes.
So on a net basis, if we were going to say we're not paying you the $34K or paying you the $220K, we would get roughly back $820,000 $25,000, or whatever the math works out to be. Is
The
that-
1.08 minus the 225.
Yeah, and minus the 34.
Right.
Okay. All right, I just wanted to understand the math. Thanks.
When do we need to pay this to the state to get reimbursed? Because I'm wondering why this isn't a CIP line item in the budget you're putting together right now, that we're going to see in a month from now, or a month and a half from now. Much to our point in our budget overview.
I think that the simplest thing is conceptually, we're finishing off a capital project. And in fact, we're not coming back looking for new authorization to spend money, in one sense. What happened is, we had the appropriation up to $3.9 million to spend it. I believe that was the number, right?
Yes.
But that assumed 100% reimbursable projects. So think about this as, in fact, notification to the Board of Selectmen, to the Board of Finance, and to the RTM that we are not getting reimbursed for 100% of the cost. The town now has a contribution to this.
Okay. Where will that money come from, since it was not in the 2010, 2011 budget?
It will be, right, the proposal here is to
It'll be
bond.
bonded. 20-year bonding?
Because because we're tying this to the capital project. Conceptually, Mr. DeWitt, you're correct. You could turn around and say, let's fund it in the operating budget. You could turn around and say, let's take it out of surplus. You could turn around and say, let's do it in non-recurring and fund it over 3 to 5 years, not over the 20. The proposal here is because it's part of an ongoing capital project, or soap opera, as Mr. White said,
No.
is to include it as part of the 3 million plus. So in this case, we had the appropriation, we didn't get the grant to the level that we thought we would. It's conceptually the same as running over budget $200,000 on the project. We didn't do that. But it's money
It's
the
not a
town
timing
hadn't-
thing.
It's money the town hadn't planned to contribute.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Ms., I thought you
It-
were
it just-
following
it's-
up on that.
In just the green, in the grand scheme of the fact that we have a plan for our capital appropriations right now, and we're doing this yearly, this is my constant complaint. We just keep adding to it, and adding to it, and adding to it. We don't ever have a cap where we say, oh, 225 just came up, now I got to take something out of that grand plan that we have, because we have $225 new $1,000 of new bonding. And I understand it's an overrun, and I understand it's necessary, but I would think, as I thought we were going to see, whenever there's a new bonding something, whether it's an overrun or a new project or a new school, whatever, we're going to see a big plan that says, here's my $15 million bonding plan for the next 5 years, been reduced by 225 out of this budget line item because we had this unfortunate problem with an engineer.
I think there's two levels of that, and I think you're correct in terms of how you're looking at that. I think step one is, because there's several different ways to fund it, and this board could choose not to fund it as part of the bonding, first thing we need to do is to see that. All right, and the proposal here is that we do it as part of, in essence, part of the same long-term bond that we're going to use on the other end. Beyond that, we certainly could look at putting this as part of what I'll call the non-recurring, to our earlier discussion, and decide to fund it over a shorter-term piece. And then that would certainly lead into updating the waterfall chart to show you what the impact is, show the board as well as the RTM what the impact of that is.
Thank you.
Mr. Stone?
Just for the record, how long did this whole project take from start to finish? Because I remember starting it when I was on the RTM.
Yeah, the bridge was, well, I mean, we started the grant application and that.
Well, the construction I'm talking about.
Construction was complete in August 2006.
But how long was it? How many, start to finish?
It took 2 years to finish, so 2004 to 2006.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments? Mr. Polito, and then Mrs. Leclerc.
My question, I guess, is for bond counsel, if bond counsel's present.
He is.
Good, thanks. How are you?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Just trying to make some sense of this. My understanding is this. We originally appropriated $3.9 million for this project, and there was a bond resolution that went out for that. Understanding there was the expectation that it was 100%.
There were 4 bond resolutions.
Oh, okay. Even more complicated. But they totaled up to $3.9 million, correct? Okay.
That's correct.
The understanding with each of the 4 was that this was 100% reimbursable?
Each of the 4 resolutions, pretty much starting, by the way, in January 28th of 2002, pretty much says the same thing, which is that it appropriates a certain amount of money, but it has specific specific language in each resolution that it's 100% reimbursable from the federal and state grants. To the appropriation question earlier, although there's an appropriation for $3.9 million, there's no authority from this board to spend town funds to do that, which when Mr. Hiller pointed out the need for that, we immediately said, you've got to go back and get authorization because the original authorization did not include any town funds.
Right. So that goes to my question. So what you're essentially saying is that even though we bonded $3.9 million through those 4 resolutions, essentially those funds were not available to spend because they were anticipating reimbursement from the state. Would that be a correct statement?
Those funds.
We didn't bond. You said we bonded 3.9. They were basically just appropriation resolutions.
That's what I'm
They
getting
did not
confused with.
contemplate
Okay, they were not bonded,
bonding.
you're saying.
No town money was ever bonded for this.
Okay.
This is the
Now I
first
get it.
time
And it
it's
would
been.
all
Okay.
come from federal and state money, which of course at this point is no longer available to fund whatever portion is left.
All right. Now I get it. Now I get it. All right. Thank you.
So this actually, if you notice, the resolution is drafted a little bit differently than normal because it doesn't include an appropriation resolution. It really includes the bonding resolution.
Okay. I got it. Thank you.
Mrs. Leclerc?
Well, while you're there, let me ask my second question first. Mr. Tetro referred before that we have a choice on how to do this, and one was Chris's way, like through the non-recurrent, or the one that's currently in front of us with a separate bond resolution. What is the cheapest way for us to do it, or is it really the same?
I think it's probably the same. I mean, that's really a policy matter of where you want to slot your capital money in. Presumably, if you approve this, I'm not going to speak for Mr. Hiller and the financial advisor on this, but presumably since these are monies that are already out the door for a project that's rather old, I imagine he'll slot this into one of the bond issues with a lesser maturity than he would other maturities, because it's not it's a long-term project to bridge, but it's already been in operation for 5 years.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question I had is, and I'm almost afraid to ask, but it says that the state wouldn't pay us if we submitted costs from more than 120 days after the completion of the bridge. If we had kept the bridge closed and inconvenienced everyone for a longer time period until the engineer had signed off, would we have gotten reimbursed?
No, I don't, no. There's a certain point in time, it's a good idea, but the neighbors would have gone nuts. And the second thing is that there's a certain time where the inspection reports show that it's substantially complete and the contractor is due his money, and that says that the bridge can be opened. So we couldn't just arbitrarily say, keep it closed.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? So let me tell you where I stand on this. It's good that we originally thought it was going to cost 3.9, it's only costing 3.5. Great. It's sad that this is 5 years down the road and we're still contemplating it, okay? I do appreciate, for one, the fact that this is a separate bond resolution and this calls it out separately, and this addresses the topic correctly. And I'm glad, Mr. Hiller, I think you were the one who brought it up originally, now that, hey, it was appropriated, but it was never meant to be town funds. So I think that method of control worked, and that's a good thing, that it's going back through the approval process.
I appreciate the presentation, and I think I understand the fact pattern, which is the project was undertaken. The project ran into unforeseen circumstances due to complications, engineering complications, and that kind of happens. There were some concerns with the way perhaps the construction team mitigated some of the risks, and you were able to negotiate down a settlement with the construction team that minimized the cost to the taxpayer. All of that is great from our standpoint, and I think that's efforts well done. You had the other complicating factor of the town, or the state kind of changing the rules of the game, right? You had to get the state legislators involved to get us some of the money back that was originally promised, but because of the time lag, the rules of the game had changed. Also, that's very good. The one thing that bothers me, and the only thing that bothers me about this, was the discussion about the fact that the engineer caused some of the delay in meeting the 120 days because of the fact that they had personnel problems. I pay an outside firm so they manage their personnel problems, and I don't have to. And the fact that within this 225, the expectation is they're paid in full, $35,000 owed to them, that bothers me.
No.
And by the way, just let me, I'm on a
No,
roll.
I'm sorry. I'm
No,
sorry.
that bothers me,
I'm
and,
sorry.
and I'm not one who's saying, go litigate this, go sue them. That's not the way, but, but that's not the way I do business. When I hire a vendor and they're not able to contribute, or they're not able to live up to their obligations due to their own personnel matters, we typically work together and there's a cost reduction involved. I see no evidence that that happened here. And I'm uncomfortable saying, yeah, okay, pay him the 35 grand. I just have a problem with that.
Let me just clarify something.
Sure.
Because when we go back to the delay, okay, that got us on the other side, 120 days, right? There's no doubt that negotiating with the contractor over that big change order was going to put us outside that 120 days. For whatever reason, he wasn't banging at the door for his money, and, you know, he's threatening to go to court, et cetera. It was what it was going to be. I made the point that even if that didn't occur, we probably wouldn't have been able to, probably wouldn't have been able to close out the project because of, it takes time, much more time than used to be anticipated. I don't know how, well, it's going to be, all I'm saying is difficult to go back to the engineer when he's got one window there, the 120 days he was going to exceed because he was doing the right thing to get that change order reduced for us.
So he was the same guy who's negotiating down that
Yes,
change order
yes.
with the
But
contractor.
within that window is what I consider to be, you know, some loss of time because of an inspector leaving his firm, et cetera. So you
So
understand
was-
what I'm saying? One's within the other time.
I might, but let me ask a question. Was the engineer the primary negotiator to get that change order reduced from the 450?
Definitely is.
So what they did was, did they get paid additional funds to do that? Was the engineer paid additional funds?
Yes.
So how much more was he paid additionally to negotiate down for us the change order? By the way, I have no problem paying him for that.
Yeah, I know. I'd have to look back, and I don't know off the top of my head, no. Because two things were occurring simultaneously. He was closing out the books.
Yep.
And he was negotiating with the contractor to reduce the change order. But I don't know if I can separate that out and how he submitted his bills, what was assigned to, you know, the two different tasks.
Okay.
But you understand the point I make when I go back to say that the 120 we were going to exceed because of the change order
I do.
negotiations.
I do.
And the other, even if we didn't do that, there were going to be some delays because of problems with inspection continuity.
Okay.
But they were still going to be within that 120 days.
Mr. DeWitt, did you have something? No, Mr. Polito?
Is it normal or typical in these types of projects that an engineer would be conducting negotiations with a contractor?
Sure.
Is it really? I'm just,
Yeah, what
never
he's
heard of that.
doing, what he's doing is the contractor is making a claim based on, it cost me this much labor, this much materials to achieve the result, and he's questioning if, number one, they're valid, because...
So essentially, he's acting like an owner's rep, is what you're saying?
Without a doubt, yes.
Okay, all right, I got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Tom?
All right, yeah, Mr. Brown?
Just a question on the 120 days. Because what you're saying, Richard, you knew you weren't going to make the 120 days.
Yes.
Okay. So there's no way before the 120 days is up to appeal to the state and let them know, look, under these circumstances, I can't make it because this is what's happening.
Right. To be...
So
to be-
before the 120 days is up, because if you knew you weren't going to make it, there's no way to call the state beforehand and let them know.
No,
Why?
that's a good point, Mr. Brown, and I take responsibility for that, in the sense that the first funding agreement for this project was written in 2003. And I reviewed it back then. I didn't take a mental note of that 120-day criteria. So I didn't have it in my mind that we passed it, and we should have got something written from the state saying that, you know, they're going to extend it for us. But I also was under the impression, because they were fully aware that this change order had to be negotiated, and there was a lot of paperwork resulting to that, that was going to take time, that they would work with us on that. I got a feeling that they forgot about it, the 120 days, until when they went back to the original funding agreement to create the second one, they saw the 120 days and realized that they had that restriction. That's just my opinion, but I honestly forgot it on my side.
Okay. How much did we pay the engineering firm in total? And what was the name of the engineering firm?
C Consultants,
I'm sorry, see what?
SEA
Consultants?
Consultant. Our total engineering costs were $785,273.
$780,000?
$785,000.
So I don't know, seems to me that we can keep the $34,000. And the other thing, I know this is hindsight, right? But we're going to have other projects.
I mean,
It just
with legal
seems to me
advice,
that we're pretty quick to pay these vendors before we know what the end game is for us, for the town.
I'm sorry, repeat that again,
It
please.
just, I don't know why we would pay $700,000 before we knew what was going to take place on our side, on the town side.
Okay. I mean, I honestly...
I just don't know why we pay so, you know, $700,000, and now we're stuck with $225,000. And again, this is, it's 10 of 11, this is hindsight, this is just something for the next project. And I would fight this $34,000, I wouldn't pay it.
Okay. No, I respect that comment. Just to back up quickly for a second, as this process is going on, I'm trying to close out this thing, I don't know what choice I have but to ride that horse to its completion. I mean, he's the one who's got all the engineer is the one that's got all the data and information to satisfy the state to get the supplemental funding agreement prepared. So I don't know, I don't think it would have been wise to stop paying him and try to bring on another engineer to pick up the process at any given time.
All right. I mean, you know, you're dealing
I
with
know
it,
what
I'm
you're
not dealing with it, I'm just, I just point out 700 and something thousand dollars is a boatload of money.
I hear you.
You know, we're stuck with $225,000, partially because of him. All we have left with leverage now is $34,000. I might consider using that at this point,
I hear you.
especially if he wants to do future work with the town. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Just quickly, and I know it's late, I think Mr. Brown makes a good point with reference to the $35,000 to the engineer, but beyond that, if I heard Mr. White correctly earlier, I mean, the engineer was at least partially to blame for the incorrect information that the contractor was using that caused his firm to go over.
No,
And-
that was a prior engineer.
Pardon?
That was the prior engineer's boring, so he inherited those.
But he bought that firm, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and in addition to that, the contractor possibly erred along the way in how he made those drills. You had mentioned that as well, right? You did say earlier that you weren't necessarily in agreement with how the contractor went about some of the additional depth work.
Right, well, only in the sense that he had to keep going down deeper
Right.
to find bedrock, okay?
I got that.
And he had shale rock, which is a tricky substance in the
Right.
sense you think you got it, you hit it, and it flakes away, and you gotta keep going down further.
Right.
What he was liable for in an error on was making sure he had a stable structure of sheeting to protect his work. And as a result, it collapsed, and that was one of the things he made a claim for, which was argued.
Exactly. So,
It
I
wasn't
mean,
valid.
I don't know enough to know whether that's completely his fault or the engineer's fault or a combination. And quite frankly, I don't care. I don't think we should pay either one of these vendors. And I don't know what the repercussions of that are. But, you know, I don't think the taxpayers of our town should be forced to pay for this overage based on what I know about it tonight. Either the engineer or the contractor, even though it's a reduced number, I think it needs to be reduced to zero.
Yeah, I just feel necessary to make the comment. I think that, you know, they were very earnest and complicated with experts on both sides with respect to that change order to bring it down to what it was. And I think it's a valid, my personal opinion, it's a valid payment to the contractor.
Thanks.
Anybody else? Do I have a motion on this item?
No, I do have another question, because Kevin brought it up earlier. Is the, you know, in order to get the funding, the rest of the funding from the state, are we required to pay the rest of this amount due to the engineer? Because, I mean, don't you think that's a,
I really don't know the answer to that. I was, to be honest with you, when I put this thing together, I envisioned as closing this thing out, which was those two pieces, paying the people we owed and getting the money to do the supplemental agreement. I don't know the answer if that's,
because if one's, you know, not contingent on the other, then,
but there's no doubt that we can't get, certainly with the contractor's costs are in this, you know, funding agreement. They're included in those numbers. So it's, certainly the state isn't going to pay us, refund this grant money for money that we didn't pay out to the contractor. So, I mean, the agreement would have to be adjusted to reflect that.
okay, yeah.
But they're not
So
repaying
it's
us
gonna
this
be
money.
reduced.
They're not repaying us this money. That's the point. You could pay them out everything except the 225.
Which is which can be related to the engineering costs.
Okay. so
That,
they
I
could-
mean,
so they could
that
pay
was
us
the point I think
everything
Mr.
in, so
DeWitt
that-
had before.
okay,
They're not
well,
repaying us. It's not like we're going to keep any of the state money. We're saying anything that the state gives you, pay them out completely. But as for the 225,
You could reduce it by the, yeah.
Go ahead.
Reduce it by-
Go ahead.
Could we, no, my only point, if I could.
I'm sorry, please.
No, my only point is that the 225, the way I look at it, is related to the engineering costs. I think, in terms of the contractor, he's done, the work was completed, he made a claim, it was negotiated down. I felt in good faith by our engineers that we agreed to and signed off on as a change order, and I think he's due his money.
Well, how much does the engineer do?
Oh, yeah,
I said
In
the
total.
contractor.
and that's
How much
okay.
does the engineer do in total? 34,000?
Correct.
That's it? That's all he's paid? That's all he's due is 34,000?
That's correct.
So we've paid him 785, or we've paid him 750, and he's owed $35,000 more.
I think he's been paid.
Right. Correct.
Right, okay. I just want to confirm that. Go ahead.
I'm just trying to think, see, if, given the hour, if this is where
Yeah.
to bring this. Would it be feasible or prudent for us to put the vote off till our next, whenever the next available meeting to vote on it would be? And at the same time, and I don't know if instruct's the right word, or recommend that the first selectman and Mr. White and Mr. Hiller investigate or even discuss. I mean, if I was the engineer, I would say, my goodness, you know, please, don't send us the last check. We've made it $750,000, and, you know, clearly we were involved in this error, if not causing it.
Would you want to turn that into a motion?
Sure. Without Mr. Tetro next to me, it's hard for me to make the motions in English, but.
You want to make,
Mike, would you like, no?
No.
So I guess I would move to postpone the vote to a date certain.
what's the date of
February 7th.
February 7th?
Okay. While recommending to the administration to negotiate with the engineer over the remaining
If I could just
fee.
make one point. I did send an email, and I have it on record, that requesting the engineer to absorb those monies because we exceeded that, the 85% criteria and other things, and we weren't getting refunded for that. And he refused that. Perhaps I shouldn't have started off with greetings, Merry Christmas, but he did refuse that.
I think being polite's nice. I mean, you know,
You let me write your email.
So,
I have no issue.
Well, it strikes me that, pursuant to my motion, the only risk we have by putting this off till February 7th is a slight delay in applying to get our $1,085,000. Right? It's not going to jeopardize that application. We're already past 120 days, right? So obviously, there's different ways to negotiate with people and different ways to discuss with them the $35,000. And as Mr. Brown said, you know, we're developing quite a list of vendors on this board that we no longer want to deal with, particularly in the roofing business, apparently. And, you know, I'm not trying to be mean or play hardball or anything here, but this may be an issue for us, and you may want to communicate to this firm that this board is concerned about this, and, you know, we're thinking very carefully about who our future vendors are, and, you know, they might want to rethink their position on the last $35,000 in light of that. And at the same time, you could bring it back, I mean, that's just my recommendation.
No, I know.
And you can end it Happy New Year.
Yeah.
well, no,
So I guess I would throw that motion, I
For-
guess
just-
that's the motion I'm making, to postpone it till the 7th with a recommendation from this board to the administration.
Do we have a second of that motion? Okay. So that motion is now before us. Any other?
Just quick discussion.
Yeah.
It's a great motion, and I have a great deal of respect for it, but I'm going to vote no on the motion because I think the stronger message to send to all parties involved is to vote on it and to vote no, which would be my intent to do, and just send that message back to the people and let them hear that no versus, well, we don't like it, bring it back to us next month. So I'm going to vote no on this resolution, on the motion.
I would agree entirely with Mr. Kiley. We've had this issue come up before where we postpone things. I don't know that we're going to be getting any new information in the next month, so let's do it tonight and get it over with and say no, and if that's this board's intention, and that just send the message loud and clear to the contractor and the engineer, that we're tired of this. We're tired of this whole way of doing things where we just kind of pay everybody and take it on the chin, and the taxpayer gets stuck with the bill.
So what would the I mean, I'm asking this out loud, what would the ramifications of voting no be?
You're
Right,
jeopardizing your $1,850,000.
Oh,
Well, you're jeopardizing your $1,800,000.
Well, that's what I'm
Yeah.
concerned about.
I don't know that that's a fact.
That hasn't been clear. That hasn't been
Let's ask-
clear.
$1 million.
Does bond counsel or Mr. Tetro have a comment on that item?
I can't even get to that now.
I would suggest that you support the motion to postpone. I would suggest that you ask Mr. White and myself to come back with kind of a more complete picture here. I'm not comfortable, based on the discussion here, that we've clearly defined what the issues are, what drove the time sensitivity, and what pushed us past the guideline. I could paint one picture that, in fact, we had a $400,000, $500,000 bill. We invite an engineer in to help us get that down. He does that, and now we don't want to pay him. That's not a way to treat vendors that saved you $300,000 or $400,000.
Yep.
However, and to Mr. Kiley's point, I would suggest you consider this. You can vote no on February 7th. I just, we're taking 30 days to get a better explanation to put you in a better position to vote no if you don't like what we come up with. If you vote no, it goes back through the whole process. You're delaying that 3 or 4 months at the earliest, if not worse. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Tetro. Mr. Polito?
From what I understand tonight, there's no real time constraint on this, because you're talking about postponing this vote a month. If we vote no tonight, there's nothing prohibiting you from bringing it back again with further information. Would that be correct? There's nothing that would, our voting no tonight, not on the motion to postpone, but voting no on the merits, is there anything that's going to prohibit the town from coming back with a different, more detailed proposal and still getting the money from the state?
You won't see it at the earliest till March, maybe April, if you vote no.
And what impact would that have in terms of the state doing what they do? Have they put a deadline on this saying that we need an answer by such and such a date, kind of like with the Metro Center funding?
That, I don't know. Mr. White?
They haven't communicated the deadline.
Of course they don't care, because they're holding $1 million they don't have to give to us. They want us to wait.
Yeah, I would, you're within your power to vote no, and send us back. My recommendation would
Just
be to
to-
postpone it and let us get some more information for you
Just-
before you vote no.
Just to
That's all.
support my own motion, I have to tell you that I'm comfortable waiting by my motion till February 7th for the more information, but I must say that given the financial condition of the state, any extensive delay, I know this is a legal thing that would be very difficult to back out of, but any extensive delay that gives the state an opportunity to think of a way not to pay us the money, I'm not comfortable with. I'd much rather see a way to close this thing out on February 7th, which is what I think my motion gives us a chance to do. It doesn't mean we will do it, but it gives us a chance, whereas what Mr. Tetro's saying is voting no tonight, I understand the emotion, believe me, could delay this by 3, 4, 5 months, and then potentially, and I don't like the sound of that, to tell you the truth.
Mr. Polito?
Mr. Tetro, if we give you a month, can you get us something in writing from the town attorney, a written formal legal opinion that lets us know whether the $1.5 million from the state is contingent upon us passing the supplemental agreement? Can we get that clearly defined in a written legal opinion from the town attorney by February 7th?
If we need to, I think the issue is let us come back and define all the parameters that are involved in this. I think your question's well taken. What is at risk? What do we lose? What don't we lose? That's one part, what the state funding is and how the reimbursement works, right? And making sure that we're not owed any additional paperwork or sign-offs by the folks that we're talking about here. It's also kind kind of what our options are at that point. So if a legal opinion is necessary, fine, but
I think it is because the thing I'm struggling with, if you're telling me that if we don't approve this $225,000, that we will not get reimbursed from the state from the 1.5, that leads me down one path. If you're telling me that we'd like you to pass this so we can get our vendors paid and close the books, but it doesn't matter in terms of what the state's going to give us, that leads me down a different path. And I've been hearing conflicting things here tonight factually, and I'm unclear about it. So that's what I want to get clarified from our town attorney.
I think there's a fair amount of confusion.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't disagree with that. And what I'm suggesting is let us work together and get a clear, concise presentation back to you so that confusion goes away.
Thank you.
Okay,
Mr. White.
Just one final point.
Okay.
Just the two payments we owe, $34,000 to the engineer and the other one to the contractor of $230,000. I look at them separate in terms of our obligations. The $230 is a result of, again, negotiations and myself representing the town signing off on the change order that it was appropriate. So that money, in my opinion, is owed them, but
I have to say, I respect that, and I'll stand by my earlier statement. My concern is more with the 34,000 than it is with the whole thing and getting clarification on some of the matters regarding that. And I think the point is well taken as to what level of involvement the engineer had in negotiating down the overage from the contractor has to be taken into consideration. But certainly, you know, paying $785,000 to the engineer on this project, where you've expressed your concern with how certain matters were handled, is a concern for me, and that's what it comes down to. So I'd look forward to just more information.
I think more information from a standpoint that assuming we clearly enumerated the parameters
Yeah.
to the engineering firm, that'd be one thing.
Yep.
If they exceeded that 120-day guideline and we never told them about it, there's a certain catch-22 in that. Please save us several $100,000, and by the way, we won't pay you either because you took too long to negotiate that.
Sure.
So all I'm suggesting is that we get a little bit more complete presentation in terms
agree.
of what the issues were so that this board can make a complete and informed decision.
I agree. Thank you. Any other comments, questions from board members on the motion? Seeing none, I'll go to the public. Does anybody have any comments on this item? Or did we wear you all down? All right. We'll go back to the board. The motion before us is to table this item, the $225,000 in financing for the remaining unpaid costs incurred in connection with the construction of the Harbor Road Bridge until a date certain. That be our February 7th meeting, and to request that the administration go back to the vendors and provide additional color to us on the increased cost, as well as try to reduce the fees. Accurate? Okay.
And exactly what is required to get reimbursement from the state.
Exactly, thank you. And exactly what is legal opinion as to what is required to get reimbursed from the state.
More worried about that.
Thank you. Okay, that is the motion before us. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That motion carries. So that item will be back before us on February 7th, and hopefully not as long a time. Okay, we do have one more item before us.
Mr. Flynn,
Yes?
would it be possible to consider postponing this next item, given the time of the evening?
I think we missed an RTM meeting. Let me ask.
Yeah,
We
this
we do have some time constraints on this with the state.
This one's time sensitive.
Perhaps it should have been first.
They wanted this in last month.
Yeah, all right. Item number 60 here, consider an act upon a resolution authorizing the issuance of bonds in the principal amount of $961,400 to finance the replacement of the Merritt Street Bridge, and authorize the first selectman to sign the agreement entitled Agreement between the State of Connecticut and the Town of Fairfield for the construction, inspection, and maintenance of the replacement of the Merritt Street Bridge over Horse Tavern Brook, utilizing federal funds from the Highway Bridge Program. Back to you, Mr. White.
The bridge is 80 years old. It's past its expected useful life. In 2005, DOT inspectors rated the bridge in poor condition. As a result, I requested $150,000 to hire a consulting engineer to proceed with design. Design was progressing well, so based on the engineer's estimate, I requested $700,000 in 2006 for construction. The estimate turned out to be extremely way off. The design hit major obstacles which caused delays in obtaining permits and acquisition of a private easement that went to court for resolution. The final design, including all the necessary permits and easements, was recently completed, and DOT has forwarded the funding agreement that provides for 80% federal funding for the construction cost of $1,661,400, leaving a local 20% share of $332,280. Because this is a reimbursable grant, the town must appropriate the total construction cost and receive reimbursements as invoices are processed from the engineer and contractor. The amount requested is the $1,661,400 construction cost estimate, less the $700,000 previously appropriated, equaling $961,400. The project briefly involves demolition, removal of the old bridge, replacement with a new bridge, similar in looks with a stone facade. We addressed the two neighbors' concern was make it look like the old one, which the stone facade does. The second request that the neighbors had was to try to make the intersection safer, which we did. If you look at this, currently it's more of a Y shape, so the crowds coming up here sweep through this easier than when they come down here, because it's more like this angle. They see what's coming, they blow through the stop sign. So we've angled it, bumped this out a little bit, and sharpened this corner to make it more like a T, a traditional stop, safer, et cetera. It'll involve a simple detour around it because the bridge will be completely closed. Construction is expected to start in June and be completed in less than 12 months. That's basically it.
And all the costs have been vetted by DOT and everything's been signed off on?
Yes.
And it's 80% reimbursable, and you're asking for the 961, so really we're talking about $180-some-odd thousand to the town on expense here, net.
I'm sorry, say that again, Tom?
Additional. You have, the request is $961,000. Of that 961, 80% of that is reimbursable, correct?
Yes.
So 96 plus 96, a little over 192,000 of this is what's really the cost to the town,
Yeah.
right?
It's going to be, because you got to look at the $1.6 million figure, that you're looking at.
But we've already appropriated that, though, is what
Yeah,
I'm saying.
but we hadn't borrowed all that.
I understand, but we've
So
appropriated
our
it.
total cost is going to be 330, a little over
Right.
330,000.
Right. But the option, I mean, the issue is, it's either this or you close the bridge, right?
Yes.
Question, comments, concerns on this item? Mrs. Leclerc?
My question's for Mr. Tetra. Is there any possible grant money, like community block grant money available that could be applied towards the bridge?
I'll check with Mark, but in the past, when I've brought these projects up, there hasn't been.
Did you run that by Mark recently?
Yeah, let me go to Ms., are you all set, Mrs. Leclerc? or-
Okay. Just
go
to
ahead.
follow up on the
Sorry.
answer, we'll go back and confirm with Mark, but we're not optimistic at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Stone, and then I'll go to Mr.
Just
Kemp.
out of curiosity, who's the engineer?
A different one.
That's what I was hoping. We might be running out of them, but.
No, that's 120-day restriction. That 120-day restriction is in the contractual line agreement.
Okay.
It was Clough Harbor, which was selected through a RFP process.
Are you all set? Okay, Mr. Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not trying to be flippant, I know it's late, but every time I drive over the new Mill Plain Bridge, which is beautiful, the question I ask myself, and quite frankly, the question a lot of people ask me, is why did that bridge take so long to build? Or I would ask tonight, why does it take 12 months to build a bridge?
Right.
Why does it take so long? Why can't something be done on a...
Well, 12 months is the outer limit of this. It's expected to be, I
Right.
would say, 9 months or less. The Mill Plain Road Bridge was very unique. All the utilities had to be moved back, for one thing, before he could even get started. He had two restrictions on the time he could work on the water. One was created by conservation, and the other one was from the state fishery. So he can only work in the water for a very limited amount of
Okay.
time. That pushed him automatically into 2 seasons. The third utility that was there was the transcontinental
Railroad?
telephone line that had to be handled with kid gloves, et cetera, and that caused problems.
Okay.
And it was what it was.
Okay.
And and the contractor is allowed a winter shutdown for December and January.
For 2
And it was
months.
a bad winter, and he took it.
Okay. But if we were to start this in March or April, is that conceivable that it could be done before December?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Mr. Polito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very briefly, how did a private easement come into play here? You're talking about replacing an existing bridge. What was
Right.
the deal with that?
Right, to meet the new state safety standards,
Widened?
the guardrail, which doesn't exist on this bridge, had to be reconfigured.
Okay.
So they have those like blunt end, so you don't have a blunt corner, it like angles in.
Okay.
It had the angle on the guy's property, and that caused.
So essentially, you had to widen the bridge, more or less.
The guardrail had to extend out
Okay,
further
that's
into
fine.
the, yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments, concerns? All right, seeing none, do I have a motion? Do I have a second? All right, the item is before us. Any questions, comments, concerns from the public on this item? Mr. Tetro?
Quickly, and I think for this board to consider for a process improvement, some of the questions, certainly not all, that this board get asked at the Board of Selectmen meeting, especially the fact that there's either 4 weeks, 2 to 4 weeks between Board of Selectmen meetings and this board's meeting. Would think it would be helpful to have the Board of Selectmen minutes in your packet for any item that comes before you, so you can review that ahead of time.
That'd be great. Thank you. Can we get that going forward?
I think you should address that comment to your clerk.
Yeah, I just did. I think I just did. Boy, he's getting cranky in his old age.
celebrate or something? Go eat some cake.
By the time we get done, he's going to be 61. All right. Item number 6. To hear, consider, and act upon a motion, a resolution authorizing the issuance of bonds in the principal amount of $961,400 to finance the replacement of the Merritt Street Bridge, and authorize the first selectman to sign the agreement entitled Agreement Between the State of Connecticut and Town of Fairfield for the Construction, Inspection, and Maintenance of the Replacement of the Merritt Street Bridge over Horse Tavern Brook, utilizing federal funds from the Highway Bridge Program. That's the item before us. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? That item passes. Mr. Hiller, any communications?
No, sir. I have copies, if you'd like, of which were emailed to you, the Standard & Poor's credit rating report.
Okay. And any other items, any other business? No other item. Mr. White, I want to thank you very much, and thank you for sticking around. Do I have a motion? I'll take Ms. Gaffney. Do we have a second? Mr. Polito? All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? We're adjourned.
I think we should start our meetings at around 11 o'clock.